Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The apartment smelled wrong from the first moment we crossed the threshold. Not the musty odor of disuse or the chemical tang of fresh paint, but something underneath, like copper and old paper. My wife pressed her palm against the living room wall, testing its solidity, and I watched her fingers leave temporary impressions in the surface before it smoothed itself back. She didn't notice, or pretended not to. The landlord had been remarkably eager to close the deal, his pen trembling slightly as he pushed the lease across his desk. The rent was a third of what we'd been paying in our previous place, and when I'd asked why, he'd simply said the building had a reputation for being quiet. Too quiet, he'd added, then laughed in a way that sounded rehearsed. We signed anyway. Financial desperation has a way of making you ignore the warning signs your instincts are screaming about. The first 3 nights passed in unsettling silence. The building around us seemed to exist in a vacuum. No footsteps from above, no distant televisions, no pipes groaning through the walls. Just our breathing and heartbeats, amplified in the stillness. My wife mentioned that she kept waking at 3:47 a.m., always the exact same time, with the sensation that someone had just stopped speaking. I told her it was the stress of the move, the adjustment to a new space. I didn't mention that I'd been waking at 3:47 too, my ears straining toward the bedroom wall, convinced I'd just missed hearing something vital. On the 4th night, the voices began. I was standing at the kitchen sink, water running over dirty dishes, when I heard it, muffled but distinct, coming from the wall that separated our unit from 4B. A conversation, rising and falling in natural rhythm, though I couldn't make out individual words. Just the cadence of human speech, intimate and close. I turned off the faucet. The voices continued. 2 people, maybe 3, discussing something with urgency. The tone suggested disagreement, concern, the kind of late-night debate that happens when decisions need to be made. I pressed my ear to the wall. The voices grew clearer but remained just beyond comprehension, like listening to a radio stuck between stations. I pulled back, skin prickling. The super had told us during the walkthrough that 4B had been vacant for years, ever since the previous tenants simply stopped paying rent and disappeared, leaving everything behind. The management company had cleared it out, but no one had wanted to lease it since. Something about the layout being wrong, he'd said. Doors that opened the incorrect way, windows that showed views they shouldn't. My wife appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the kitchen's fluorescent glow. She asked if I heard it too, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention from whatever was on the other side. I nodded. We stood together in the kitchen, listening to the phantom conversation that shouldn't exist, until it faded sometime after midnight, stopping mid-sentence as if someone had simply walked out of range. The voices returned the next evening, and the next. Always after dark, always with that same urgent quality. We tried to ignore them, turned up the television, played music, ran the shower. But the voices persisted underneath, patient and inexorable. They never seemed bothered by our attempts at drowning them out. If anything, they grew more insistent, more audible, as if feeding off our attention. I started catching fragments, individual words breaking through the murmur. My name, my wife's profession, the street where we'd lived before. Small details that should have been meaningless, but strung together they formed a pattern. A catalog of our lives being discussed by unseen speakers. My wife stopped sleeping. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, her hands pressed flat against its surface, as if she could push through to the source. The wall always felt warm under my touch, feverish, like skin stretched over something living. On the 8th night, I heard my wife's voice coming from the wall. Not beside me. I could see her sitting at the kitchen table, her real form motionless and solid, but layered beneath it, coming from 4B. The disembodied version of her was arguing with someone, her tone sharp with fear. She was saying that we needed to leave, that this had gone too far, that the instructions didn't make sense. My actual wife met my eyes across the room, her expression confirming that she heard it too. The sound of herself, speaking words she hadn't said yet or might never say, or had already said in some version of events we couldn't access. That's when we first tried to leave. The front door opened easily enough, the lock turned, the hinges swung smooth and silent, but beyond the threshold, instead of the building's hallway with its worn carpet and flickering lights, we found ourselves looking back into our apartment. The same living room, the same furniture, the same us standing in the doorway looking confused. My wife stepped through first, convinced it was a trick of perception, some kind of mirror we hadn't noticed. But her foot came down on our living room floor, and she was back inside, approaching the door from the interior again. We tried for hours. The bedroom door led to the living room. The bathroom door opened into the kitchen. Every exit circled back, a snake eating its tail, trapping us in an endless loop of our own space. The windows showed the correct view, the street below, other buildings, the night sky. But they wouldn't open, and when I pressed my hand against the glass, it gave slightly like a membrane before pushing back. The voices had been observing our attempts. I could hear them discussing our progress, or lack thereof, their tone almost clinical. They mentioned that we were on schedule, that the resistance was expected, that we'd eventually understand what needed to be done. One voice, deeper than the others, suggested we'd already done it in previous iterations, that we were just remembering how. The instructions started on the 10th night. Clear and specific, no longer muffled by the wall. A voice I didn't recognize told us to move the couch 3 feet to the left. My wife laughed at first, a sharp, unhinged sound that echoed too long in our trapped space. But the voice repeated the instruction, and underneath its words I heard dozens of other voices whispering the same thing, a chorus of insistence that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. We moved the couch. Beneath where it had stood, we found a marking on the floor, not carved or painted, but somehow impressed into the wood itself, a symbol that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift between being two-dimensional and three-dimensional depending on the angle. The voices praised us. They said we were doing well, that we were closer to completing the cycle, that soon we'd understand everything. The next instruction came the following evening. Arrange our furniture in a specific pattern. The coffee table against the east wall, the chairs facing inward, the bookshelf blocking the bathroom door. It took us 3 hours. Every time we placed something incorrectly, a sharp pain would spike through my skull, and the voices would patiently correct us. My wife kept stopping to cry, her body shaking, but she never stopped moving. We both understood, without discussing it, that resistance wasn't an option anymore. The apartment wouldn't let us leave until we finished whatever ritual we'd unwittingly agreed to when we signed the lease. Days blurred together. Time moved strangely in our loop. Sometimes hours would pass in what felt like minutes. Other times a single moment would stretch into something endless. We stopped eating much. Food appeared in the refrigerator even when we knew we'd used everything. Always fresh, always exactly what we needed. The voices continued their instructions. Paint this wall. Remove that picture. Stand in this spot at this time. Sleep in the living room instead of the bedroom. Each completed task brought praise and the promise that we were almost done. I started to notice that our reflections in the windows weren't quite synchronized with our movements. They'd lag by a fraction of a second, or move when we were still, or sometimes they'd do things we didn't remember doing. Unpacking boxes we'd already unpacked, hanging pictures that we'd taken down hours before. My wife mentioned that she'd seen herself sleeping in the bedroom while she stood in the kitchen, and when she'd approached, the sleeping version had opened its eyes and smiled before fading away. The voices began telling us things about our future, specific things, that in 3 weeks I'd receive a phone call offering a job I'd been hoping for, that my wife would discover something about her family history that would change how she saw herself, that we'd have a conversation on a Tuesday afternoon that would alter the trajectory of our relationship. They spoke with certainty, as if reading from a script that had already been written. that we'd already performed in some other version of events. And the terrifying part was that they were right. The job offer came through. The family secret emerged. The conversation happened, word for word, as described. We were living out a prophecy delivered by voices from an empty apartment, and the more we tried to deviate, the more forcefully events pushed us back into alignment. On what might have been the 30th night, or the 50th, I'd lost track. The voices told us the final instruction. We needed to stand in the center of the living room, hold hands, and repeat a phrase they'd teach us. The phrase was in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood, words that felt ancient and wrong in my mouth. My wife's hand was ice cold in mine, her pulse racing against my palm. The voices began to chant, and we found ourselves chanting with them, our voices joining the chorus coming through the walls. The apartment started to change around us. The walls became transparent, showing dozens of other apartments overlaid on ours. Different furniture, different colors, different versions of ourselves living out different sequences of events. I saw myself younger, older, alone, with different people. I saw my wife making choices she hadn't made, living lives she hadn't lived. Every possible variation, all existing simultaneously in the same space, separated only by the thinnest membrane of perception. The voices said we'd completed the cycle. They said we were free to leave. They said we'd done exactly what we needed to do, what we'd always been going to do, what we'd done infinite times before, and would do infinite times again. The front door stood open, and beyond it, finally, was the hallway. We ran, down the stairs, through the lobby, out into the street. The night air felt wrong on my skin, too thick, too warm. My wife kept looking back, convinced we'd turn around and see the building pulling us back. But we made it to the corner, then to the next block, then to a hotel where we paid cash for a room and locked ourselves inside. That was 3 months ago. We never went back to the apartment. We hired movers who reported that our belongings were already gone when they arrived, the unit completely empty, as if we'd never been there at all. The landlord stopped answering our calls. The management company had no record of our lease, but the voices didn't stop. They followed us, first in the hotel, then in the temporary rental we found, then in every space we've tried to occupy since. Quieter now, more distant, but always there, coming through the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Still discussing our lives, still predicting our futures, still giving instructions we can't quite refuse. Last night, they told us we'd be moving again soon, to a place with cheap rent and thin walls, where we'd hear conversations we shouldn't be able to hear, where we'd try to leave and find ourselves circling back. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at 3:47 a.m., listening to my wife's voice coming from impossible directions, is that they're always right. The apartment listing appeared this morning. The rent is suspiciously affordable. I've already called the landlord. We're signing the lease tomorrow. My wife asked me why we're doing this, why we can't just refuse. But I can feel it. That same inexorable pull. That sense of events already written, of a script we're compelled to perform. The voices say this is the 3rd time we've done this, or the 30th, or the 300th. They say we'll keep doing it until we get it right, until we complete the cycle correctly, until we finally understand what they've been trying to teach us. I press my hand against the wall of our current apartment, and it's warm, feverish, alive. From the other side, I hear my own voice discussing tomorrow's lease signing, describing the new place with its suspicious affordability and thin walls, speaking words I haven't said yet, but will. Words I've already said, in iterations I don't remember but somehow know occurred. The voices tell me I'm almost ready to understand, that soon I'll be on their side of the wall, joining their conversation, helping guide the next version of myself through the cycle. They say it won't hurt. They say I've done it before. My wife is sleeping now, or pretending to. I can hear her breathing, but I can also hear her voice from the walls, describing this exact moment. Me standing here, questioning everything, slowly accepting what I've always known, that we never left, that we were never meant to leave, that the apartment isn't a place but a state, and we've been inside it far longer than we realize. The voices are saying my name. They're welcoming me home. They're telling me it's time to take my place in the chorus. And the most terrifying thing is that part of me, a part that's been there all along, waiting, wants to answer. Story 2. The fog rolled in thick that morning, the kind that smelled of salt and something else. Something like old photographs left too long in the sun. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hand, watching the mist devour the fishing boats in the harbor one by one. That's when I realized I couldn't remember the harbor master's face. Not clearly, just a vague impression of weathered skin and a wool cap, details that slipped away like water through cupped palms. I told myself it was nothing. Stress, maybe, the coastal air playing tricks. But the unease followed me to work, a shadow I couldn't quite shake. The library where I worked had always been quiet, but that day the silence felt different, heavier, expectant. The usual patrons didn't show. Mrs. Chen, who came every Tuesday for her mystery novels, never appeared. I caught myself trying to picture her face and finding only a blank space where her features should have been. The realization sent ice down my spine. By afternoon, I'd noticed the gaps. The small ones first. The barista at the coffee shop on Main Street. I'd bought from her for 3 years, but when I walked past, a different person stood behind the counter. A younger woman with auburn hair who looked at me without recognition when I asked about the previous employee. She insisted, with a politeness that felt rehearsed, that she'd been working there for 5 years. The coffee shop's walls bore photos of staff through the decades, but I couldn't find the face I was looking for in any of them. That evening, I went home to find my wife preparing dinner. She hummed a tune I didn't recognize, moving through our kitchen with familiar efficiency. But when I mentioned the harbor master, when I asked if she remembered Mrs. Chen from the library, she paused mid-chop, the knife hovering over half-diced onions. She said she'd never heard those names before. She said it with such certainty that I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I pulled out my phone, scrolling frantically through photos. There should have been pictures from last month's harbor festival, dozens of them. The whole town gathered on the pier, faces illuminated by fireworks. But the images showed only empty stretches of boardwalk, the night sky exploding in color above deserted wooden planks. My wife appeared in some shots, standing alone, smiling at nothing. The wrongness of it made my hands shake. That night, I lay awake listening to the foghorn's mournful cry from the lighthouse, the old one, abandoned for years now, standing sentinel at the rocky point beyond the harbor. The sound seemed different, almost like a voice calling across vast distances. My wife slept peacefully beside me, but I found myself studying her face in the darkness, memorizing every line and curve, seized by an irrational fear that I might forget her too. The next morning brought fresh horror. I found my colleague at the library, a young man who'd worked the reference desk for 2 years, sitting in what had always been his spot. But when I greeted him by name, he looked at me with polite confusion. He introduced himself as if we'd never met, shook my hand with the formal awkwardness of strangers. The name tag on his desk read the same name I'd just spoken, but he had no memory of our conversations, of the hundreds of small interactions that make up a working friendship. I checked the staff records in the back office. His file showed he'd been hired only a week ago. The fear that had been building in my chest since yesterday crystallized into something sharper, more terrible. I spent my lunch break walking the town, cataloging the empty spaces. The pharmacy where old Mr. Rodriguez used to hold court was now run by someone who claimed to be the original owner's grandson. Except I distinctly remembered Mr. Rodriguez telling me he had no children. The elementary school playground, usually alive with noise during recess, sat empty at noon. When I asked a passerby about it, she informed me, with a slight frown as if I'd asked something absurd, that the school had been closed for budget cuts 3 years ago. But I remembered walking past it just last week, hearing the laughter of children at play. By evening, the town felt like a stage set with half the props removed. Familiar streets looked subtly wrong. Houses stood where I didn't remember them. Stores had different names, different inventories. The people I passed had faces that wouldn't quite stick in my memory. features that blurred even as I looked at them. I drove home along the coast road, and that's when I saw the lighthouse. It stood against the darkening sky, its paint peeling, windows dark for decades. But something drew my attention to it, a pull I couldn't explain. The fog was rolling in again, thick and luminous in the fading light, and through it I could just make out something carved into the lighthouse's exterior wall. Names, hundreds of names, maybe thousands, scratched into the old stone and painted wood. Even from the road, I could see them covering every surface, layer upon layer of desperate inscription. I pulled over without thinking, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, accessible only by a narrow path that wound down from the road. The state had condemned the structure years ago, put up a fence with warning signs, but someone had cut through the chain link. The opening gaped like a mouth. The path down was treacherous with loose stones and scrub brush. The fog grew thicker as I descended, muffling sound until all I could hear was my own breathing and the distant crash of waves against rocks. The temperature dropped. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold. The lighthouse loomed above me, massive and decrepit. And the names. God, the names. They covered every inch of the exterior, some carved deep, others barely scratched into the surface. Some fresh, the stone around them still pale. Others so weathered they'd nearly faded away. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves, the desperation in every letter. There were dates beside many of them, some from last week, some from a century ago. I found Mrs. Chen's name near the base, carved in shaky letters beside yesterday's date. The harbor master's name was there too, and the barista's, and dozens of others I half recognized, names that sparked dim memories of faces I could no longer quite picture. The door to the lighthouse hung crooked on rusted hinges. It scraped open at my touch, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the car and drive away and never look back. But I stepped inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. Names covered the walls from floor to ceiling, spiraling up the iron staircase that led to the upper levels. Some were written in pen, in marker, in what looked like blood. Some were carved so deep they'd gone through the plaster to the brick beneath. The air inside smelled of salt and decay and something else, something like the absence of memory itself, if absence could have a smell. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the walls, and I began to read. Some of the names I recognized from my childhood here. The old postmaster who'd retired when I was in high school. A teacher from elementary school whose face I could almost remember. The mayor from 2 decades ago. All of them here. All of them carved into these walls like epitaphs. But it was the recent ones that made my breath catch. My colleague from the library, his name fresh and deep in the plaster near the door. The young couple who'd moved in next door last spring. I'd forgotten them entirely until I saw their names, and even then the memories were slippery, uncertain. And then I saw it, my own name, carved high on the wall near the stairs, the letters rough and hurried as if made in panic. But that was impossible. I hadn't been here before. I hadn't carved anything. The date beside it was from 2 weeks ago. My hand started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. The lighthouse suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I stumbled backward, and that's when I noticed the second inscription. My name again, lower down, with yesterday's date. And then a third, even lower, so fresh the plaster dust still clung to the grooves. No date beside that one, just my name, carved deep enough to last. I ran my fingers over the letters, and they were warm, as if someone had just finished them, as if the stone itself was alive. That's when I heard the footsteps on the stairs above me, slow, deliberate steps descending from the upper levels. I swept my flashlight beam up the spiral staircase, but the light seemed to die in the darkness, revealing nothing. The footsteps continued, methodical and inevitable. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, but there was no one there, just empty air and the smell of salt and forgetting. I bolted, crashed through the door and back into the fog, scrambling up the path with the lighthouse looming behind me like an accusing finger. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, didn't stop shaking until I was miles down the coast road with the lighthouse lost in the mist behind me. When I got home, my wife was in the living room, reading a book. She looked up as I entered, and for a terrible moment her face was blank, unrecognizing. Then she smiled, a polite, distant smile. She asked if she could help me with something. Asked it the way you'd ask a stranger who'd walked into your house by mistake. I stood in the doorway of my own living room, looking at the woman I'd lived with for 15 years, and saw no recognition in her eyes. Around us, the house was subtly different. Photos on the walls showed only her, or empty spaces where I should have been. The bookshelf held only her books. The coat rack by the door held only her jacket. I looked down at my hands and they seemed less solid than they had this morning, translucent at the edges, as if the fog outside was somehow seeping into my skin. She was asking again if she could help me, her voice taking on an edge of concern. Or was it fear? I couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't think clearly through the panic. I opened my mouth to explain, to remind her of our anniversary, our first date, the day we bought this house. But the words wouldn't come. The memories felt slippery, uncertain. Had those things really happened? The evidence said no. The photos, the records, her blank, kind face, all of it insisted I was wrong. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd imagined it all. 15 years of marriage, a whole life together, all just delusion, just the fantasy of a man whose grip on reality had finally slipped. I backed toward the door. She stood, book forgotten, reaching out as if to steady me. Her hand passed through my arm like I was made of mist. We both stared at where we should have touched. I could see the wall through my hand now, the paint and plaster visible through translucent flesh. The fog had gotten inside somehow, was replacing me molecule by molecule with salt air and forgetting. I thought of all those names in the lighthouse, all those people who'd carved their identities into stone and wood, fighting to leave some proof they'd existed. All of them gone now, forgotten. Nothing left but scratches on walls that no one came to read. I thought of my own name up there, written 3 times, each inscription more recent than the last. Not written by me, written by previous versions of me. Each time I'd faded enough to forget I'd already tried to remember myself into existence. How many times had I been to the lighthouse? How many times had I carved my name, only to forget I'd done it? How many times had I stood in this living room, watching my wife fail to recognize me, feeling myself dissolve into the fog? The last thought I had, before the fog took even that, was that somewhere in town, at this very moment, someone else was probably noticing the gaps, probably wondering why they couldn't remember their neighbor's face, probably starting down the path I'd walked, toward a lighthouse full of names, and the terrible understanding that comes too late. And tomorrow, when they reached for the memory of this moment, it would be gone. They'd be starting fresh, noticing the strangeness for the first time, beginning the cycle again. The fog rolled in thick through the open door. My wife stood in the living room, alone, wondering why she'd felt compelled to get up, wondering at the faint sound of footsteps fading into mist, wondering briefly if she'd forgotten to close a window. Then she sat back down with her book, the moment already dissolving. Outside, the lighthouse horn called across the water, mourning for all the names no one would ever read. Story 3. The heart beats wrong, not arrhythmically. The doctors assure me the transplant took perfectly, that my new heart pumps with mechanical efficiency, stronger than my failing organ ever did. But it beats wrong. Each pulse carries a weight that isn't mine, a rhythm that feels borrowed, stolen from someone who no longer needs it. I wake at 3:47 every morning, my hand pressed against my chest, feeling the foreign muscle contract beneath skin and bone, wondering whose life force now animates mine. 3 weeks post-surgery, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my fingers. They moved across the scarred wood surface with purpose. tapping out patterns I didn't recognize. Not random, but deliberate. Like they were searching for something that should be there but wasn't. My wife had left coffee cooling beside me before heading to work, kissing my forehead with the same careful tenderness she'd adopted since I came home, as if I might shatter. The morning light filtered through gauze curtains, turning everything pale and uncertain. My fingers found the edge of a coffee ring, traced its circumference 3 times clockwise, then reversed. The motion felt necessary, compulsive in a way that made my scalp prickle with unease. The piano arrived that afternoon. I hadn't ordered it. When the delivery men knocked, I assumed they had the wrong address, but my neighbor, the elderly woman from 4B who collected everyone's packages, confirmed she'd seen me sign for it 2 weeks ago. I had no memory of this. They wheeled it in anyway, a upright Yamaha with keys that gleamed like teeth, and positioned it against the wall where my bookshelf had been. I must have moved the bookshelf. Its absence created a void I couldn't explain, books now stacked in precarious towers around the apartment. I sat at the piano bench that evening without intending to. My body moved through the apartment like it belonged to someone else, drawn by invisible threads. My fingers hovered over the keys, and I felt my heart, that foreign heart, accelerate with something that might have been anticipation or dread. I pressed down. Music poured out. Not the halting, painful attempts of a beginner, but fluid, complex pieces that my conscious mind couldn't name but my hands knew intimately. Chopin, maybe. Or Liszt. The notes cascaded through the apartment, filling spaces I didn't know were empty, and I played for 2 hours without stopping, without thinking, while sweat collected at the base of my spine and my transplant scar throbbed with each chord change. When I finally stopped, my hands were shaking. I had never touched a piano before in my life. The phone call to my cardiologist went as expected. He spoke about cellular memory theories, about stress and recovery, about the brain's remarkable ability to create false certainty. He suggested I might have learned piano as a child and forgotten. He didn't use the word delusion, but it hung in the silence between his careful phrases. He increased my anti-rejection medication dosage. The pills tasted like copper and made my thoughts feel wrapped in cotton. But the music wasn't delusion. My fingers knew chord progressions my mind couldn't comprehend. They moved with muscle memory that belonged to someone else, someone whose heart now kept me alive. The language came next. I was at the grocery store, standing in the international aisle, when I heard 2 women speaking behind me. The sounds flowed over me like water, and I understood every word. The complaint about rising prices, the question about where to find tahini, the casual gossip about a mutual acquaintance's divorce. I turned and responded before I could stop myself, offering directions to the Middle Eastern section in flawless, fluent Arabic. Their surprise mirrored my own horror. I had never studied Arabic, had never had any interest in languages beyond the high school Spanish I'd barely passed. But the words had emerged from my mouth with native fluency, my tongue shaping phonemes it shouldn't know, my brain accessing vocabulary that had never been stored there. At home, I stood before the bathroom mirror and spoke to my reflection. Arabic phrases tumbled out, then French, then something that might have been Farsi. My voice sounded strange, inflected with accents that weren't mine, discussing topics I knew nothing about. Streets in Damascus, the proper way to prepare kibbeh, complaints about traffic near a market I'd never visited. I pressed my palm against my chest, felt the steady, wrong beat of my donor heart, and whispered in English, "Who are you?" The reflection didn't answer, but my new heart stuttered, skipped a beat that the monitoring app on my phone registered as an anomaly. The cardiologist's office called within minutes. The implanted device had triggered an alert. I assured them I was fine. I was not fine. The food came next, then the dreams. I found myself craving dishes I'd previously hated. Strong coffee thick with cardamom, lamb cooked with sumac and pine nuts, the sharp tang of pomegranate molasses. My wife watched with concern as I pushed away the meals she prepared, the comfort foods I'd always loved, and instead hunched over a laptop at 2 a.m. searching for recipes I couldn't name but somehow knew. My body rejected the tastes of my former life with the same efficiency it might reject a failing organ. But the dreams were worse. They started as fragments, flashes of unfamiliar rooms, the weight of hands that weren't mine, the smell of cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. I would wake gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape, and the details would scatter like startled birds. But they always left residue, emotional sediment that colored my waking hours with inexplicable dread. Then they became specific. I stood in a marble foyer, expensive art on the walls, my hands, but not my hands, larger with different scars, reaching for a briefcase. A voice called from upstairs, sharp with impatience. The perspective shifted, and I was climbing stairs, rage building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. A door opened, shouting, the flash of something metallic. The perspective tilted sideways, and I was falling, while pain exploded in my chest and back, and the last thing I saw was imported tile rushing toward my face. I woke screaming, my wife's hands on my shoulders, her voice cutting through the terror. She held me while I shook, while the borrowed heart in my chest beat its wrong rhythm, while I tried to explain dreams that felt less like imagination and more like playback. The psychologist my cardiologist referred me to had theories about trauma integration, about the mind processing the violation of surgery, about survivor's guilt manifesting as identification with the donor. She prescribed medication for nightmares. She didn't understand. These weren't nightmares. They were memories. I started researching. The hospital wouldn't release donor information. Confidentiality laws, they explained with bureaucratic sympathy. But I had details now. The dreams provided specifics. A home with distinctive architecture, artwork I could describe, a voice with a particular timbre, the layout of rooms I'd never physically entered. I spent days scrolling through real estate sites, news archives, obituaries. His name had been Khalil. The obituary was brief, clinical, unexpected cardiac event, services private. No mention of circumstances that felt increasingly suspicious as the dreams continued. No investigation into why a healthy man in his 40s would suffer sudden heart failure. No questions about the shouting, the rage, the flash of metal my dreams insisted had preceded his collapse. I found his address through property records, an upscale neighborhood 40 miles away, houses set back from the road behind iron gates and manicured hedges. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was investigating dreams, following the paranoid delusions of a mind altered by surgery and medication. The house matched perfectly. Every detail from my dreams, the stone facade, the curved driveway, the fountain with its bronze dolphins. I sat in my car across the street, engine running, while my heart tried to hammer through my sternum. A woman emerged from the front door, elegant in black despite months having passed, and I recognized her from dreams where she'd been angry, accusatory, alive with fury. She was his widow. The dreams made that clear now. Dreams where she'd discovered financial irregularities, where shouting had escalated, where trust had shattered. Dreams where I'd seen her face twisted with betrayal just before the pain, the fall, the tile rushing up. Had it been murder? Had someone wanted Khalil dead, staged a heart attack, and now that heartbeat in my chest, carrying fragments of his final moments? I followed her. Not consciously at first. My car simply pulled away from the curb when she drove past, maintaining distance, turning when she turned. She led me to a cemetery on the edge of town, walking between rows of headstones to one marked with fresh flowers. She stood there for 20 minutes while I watched from behind an oak tree, feeling simultaneously like a stalker and like I had every right to be there, visiting the grave of the man whose heart kept me alive. When she left, I approached the stone. His name, his dates, a brief inscription about beloved husband. Nothing about the circumstances. Nothing truthful. That night the dreams showed me more. A man in the marble foyer, someone I recognized from other dreams, Khalil's business partner, face usually smiling but now cold. An argument about money, about betrayal, about secrets that needed to stay buried. The metallic flash resolved into a syringe, its contents pushed into an IV line during what should have been a routine medical procedure. The manufactured heart attack, The perfect crime. I woke knowing his name, Garrett. I woke knowing he'd killed Khalil for money, for control of their company, for secrets I couldn't quite access but that lurked in my borrowed memory like shadows. I woke knowing he'd been following me. The signs had been there, subtle at first. A car idling too long on my street. Someone in the grocery store who seemed familiar but out of context. Footsteps behind me that matched my pace too perfectly, then disappeared. I'd attributed it to paranoia, to post-surgical anxiety, to the side effects of medications that made my thoughts feel borrowed and strange. But the dreams insisted otherwise. They showed me Garrett's face in crowds, in reflections, always watching. They whispered that he'd been monitoring the hospital, tracking transplant recipients, waiting to see if any would manifest the impossible, if Khalil's memories would surface in someone else's consciousness. I started seeing him everywhere. At the coffee shop where I'd begun buying thick Arabic coffee, sitting 3 tables away with a newspaper held too high. At the cemetery when I returned to Khalil's grave, standing behind a mausoleum, face half hidden. In my neighborhood at dusk, walking past my building with deliberate casualness. Or was I imagining it? The medications made everything feel uncertain. Reality and delusion bleeding into each other. My wife suggested I was fixating, that the stress of recovery was manifesting as paranoid delusions. She held my hands when they shook, reminded me that cellular memory wasn't scientifically supported, that dreams were just dreams. But at night, when she slept and I lay awake feeling the wrong heartbeat in my chest, I played piano in the dark. My fingers found complex pieces without error, and I spoke to myself in languages I'd never learned, and I tasted phantom flavors of foods I'd never eaten, and I knew, these weren't delusions. The heart remembered. Khalil remembered. Through me, through this borrowed muscle pumping borrowed blood, he was trying to tell his story. I started documenting everything. The dreams, the details, the faces. I compiled evidence of the financial irregularities I somehow knew about. Numbers and account transfers I shouldn't understand but did. Business deals that had enriched Garrett while destroying Khalil. I didn't know how I knew these things. The knowledge simply existed in me now, accessed through pathways that shouldn't exist. Synapses firing across the space between memory and matter. My wife found the documentation. She looked at me with something between pity and fear, and suggested I needed help beyond what my current doctors could provide. She mentioned psychiatric facilities with gentle euphemism, speaking to me the way she'd speak to someone fragmenting at the edges. Maybe I was. I couldn't tell anymore where I ended and Khalil began. His preferences had become mine. The coffee, the music, the language, even the way I moved through space felt borrowed now. I caught myself making gestures that weren't mine, standing with a posture that belonged to someone 3 inches taller, reaching for cigarettes I'd never smoked. The boundary between us had eroded, worn down by each beat of his heart in my chest. The night everything crystallized, I was playing piano at 3 a.m. A Rachmaninoff piece my fingers knew, but my mind couldn't name. The music filled the apartment, complex and mournful, and I didn't hear the door until it was too late. Garrett stood in my living room, or someone who looked like Garrett. The face from my dreams made flesh, or a figment of my fracturing psyche given form. He was both there and not there, solid, yet somehow uncertain, like he existed in the space between reality and delusion. He spoke about loose ends, about risks, about the danger of organs carrying more than just biological function. His voice matched the one from my dreams exactly, or maybe my mind simply supplied the voice it expected to hear. He moved closer, and I felt my borrowed heart accelerate with recognition. Khalil's heart remembering his killer. I ran. Out of the apartment, downstairs, my feet knew from Khalil's memory, through streets that felt familiar and strange simultaneously. Behind me, footsteps echoed, or maybe just the percussion of my own panic, my own borrowed heartbeat amplified into pursuit. I ran until my lungs burned and my transplant scar pulled tight, until I found myself at the cemetery again, among the dead who definitely no longer needed their hearts. I collapsed at Khalil's grave, pressing my palm against the earth, feeling my borrowed pulse hammer against my ribs. Was Garrett really chasing me? Or was I fleeing phantoms born from trauma and medication? Were the memories real? Or had my recovering brain constructed elaborate delusions to explain the strange new person I'd become after surgery? I pressed my ear to the ground, listening to the earth, and felt Khalil's heart beat its wrong rhythm against the cold soil of his grave. Below me, his body lay quiet, heartless. Above me, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to questions of memory and identity. The footsteps stopped. I looked up, and the cemetery was empty, or Garrett was everywhere, or I was completely alone, having fled from nothing more substantial than my own unraveling mind. My phone buzzed with messages from my wife, from my doctors, from the monitoring app reporting cardiac irregularities. I sat among the graves while my borrowed heart beat its borrowed rhythm, while Khalil's memories flickered behind my eyes like failing signals, while the distance between us collapsed into something that might have been madness or might have been truth. The heart beats wrong, I thought, pressing my hand against my chest. Or maybe it beats exactly right, keeping perfect time with a life that isn't mine but that I'm now condemned to live, carrying memories of violence I may have witnessed or simply imagined, hunted by either a killer or my own dissolution. I played Khalil's music. I spoke his languages. I ate his food and dreamed his death and lived in his borrowed pulse, and I still couldn't answer the only question that mattered. Was I uncovering his murder, or was I simply becoming him, cell by cell, beat by beat, until nothing of my former self remained except the body holding his memories together? The heart knows. The heart remembers. But whose heart is it really, when the line between donor and recipient has eroded into nothing? When memory and matter merge? When the dead speak through the living? When the rhythm that keeps you alive belongs to someone else's ending? I sit in the cemetery as dawn breaks, waiting to find out if I'm a witness or a madman, if I'm solving a murder or constructing an elaborate fiction to explain why I no longer recognize myself. The borrowed heart beats its wrong rhythm, and I can't tell anymore if it's warning me of danger or simply counting down the moments until I disappear entirely into someone else's unfinished story. The only certainty is the pulse beneath my palm, steady, insistent, wrong, always wrong. Story 4. The mirror arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in moth-eaten velvet the color of dried blood. I hadn't expected anything from Uncle Bartholomew's estate. We'd spoken perhaps 3 times in my entire life, brief encounters at family funerals where he stood in corners, watching everyone with those watery gray eyes. The lawyer's letter said he'd specifically requested I receive the Victorian standing mirror, an ornate piece with a gilded frame twisted into shapes that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. The glass itself was flawless, impossibly so for something that had allegedly stood in his study for 40 years. I placed it in the back corner of my antique shop, angled so it faced away from the main floor. Something about it made my customers uncomfortable, though none could articulate why. They'd glance at it, then quickly look away, as if they'd seen something in the reflection that didn't quite match the room around them. It was Mrs. Chen who first mentioned the delay. She'd been browsing the Empire chairs near the back when she stopped mid-step, tilting her head like a confused bird. The woman pointed at the mirror without looking directly at it, her hand trembling slightly. She told me my reflection was moving wrong, that it was slower than I was, like watching a video with bad lag. I laughed it off, blamed the old glass, mentioned how antique mirrors often had imperfections that created optical illusions. But that night, after I'd locked up and was doing my final walkthrough, I stood before it deliberately for the first time. The reflection stared back at me from the shadowed glass. I raised my right hand. The image raised its right hand approximately 3 seconds later. The movement was smooth, not jerky, as if the reflection was genuinely experiencing time differently than I was. My throat went dry. I stepped closer, and the figure in the glass stepped closer 3 seconds afterward, matching my stride perfectly but impossibly late. I should have covered it then, should have called someone, or thrown a sheet over it, or pushed it into the storage room. Instead, I found myself returning to it throughout the following day, testing it, making sudden movements, watching my delayed doppelganger mirror them with that unnerving temporal gap. The fascination grew roots in my mind. By the end of the week, I'd moved the mirror into my apartment above the shop. I told myself it was for security, that something so unusual needed to be watched more carefully. The truth was darker. I wanted to understand it, to use it. If the reflection was 3 seconds behind, then it was showing me the very recent past, which meant, and this thought came to me at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. If I could decode what it meant, I might be able to predict my own immediate future. The logic was twisted. I knew that even then. But insomnia and isolation had made me malleable to strange ideas. I started small. I'd planned to reach for a coffee cup, then watch the reflection to see if it matched my intention. It did, every time with that precise 3-second lag. I'd decide to scratch my nose, and 3 seconds later, my reflection would scratch its nose. The mirror was showing me what I had just done, yes, but in a way that felt wrong, as if the reflection wasn't merely recording but replaying something that had already been decided elsewhere. Then the divergences began. Small things at first. I'd be putting on my jacket, and the reflection would be buttoning a different button than I had. I'd pour coffee, and the reflection would tilt the pot at a slightly different angle, spilling drops on the counter that weren't actually there in my real kitchen. These inconsistencies were brief, lasting only fractions of a second before the reflection corrected itself. But they were unmistakable. I started keeping notes, documenting every deviation. The act of writing felt like a lifeline to rationality, even as the evidence I recorded seemed to pull me further from it. Thursday evening, October 24th. Reflection picked up phone receiver that I didn't touch. Reflection's expression was different, harder somehow. Saturday morning, October 26th. Reflected version of apartment showed picture frame tilted that is straight in reality. When I approached mirror, reflection seemed to notice me several seconds before it should have. Monday night, October 28th. Reflection was in different clothes, only for a moment, but certain, was wearing the gray sweater currently in my laundry basket. The shop began to suffer. I'd forget to unlock the door some mornings, would lose track of customers mid-sentence. My mind pulled back to the apartment upstairs, to the mirror, to the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. My reflection had started to look at me differently, its expressions not quite matching mine even when accounting for the delay. There was a calculating quality to its gaze, an awareness that seemed to exist independent of my own consciousness. I stopped sleeping near the mirror, started keeping it covered with a heavy blanket during the night, but I could feel it there, a presence in the darkness, showing something to an empty room. The nightmares started soon after, dreams where I walked through my apartment and saw myself everywhere, in every reflective surface, all slightly out of sync, all watching me with those evaluating eyes. I'd wake with my heart slamming against my ribs, the blanket thrown off the mirror though I was certain I'd secured it, the glass showing my sleeping form still in bed when I was clearly standing across the room. On November 2nd, the reflection showed me something that made my blood turn to ice water. I'd been standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a meal I no longer remember making. The knife in my hand was sharp, a Japanese chef's blade I'd purchased years ago. I glanced toward the mirror, which I'd positioned to face the kitchen doorway, and saw my reflection standing in the same spot, holding the same knife. But the reflected me wasn't chopping vegetables. The reflected me was walking toward the shop door, knife in hand, a terrible purpose written across features that were mine but weren't. The expression was one I'd never worn, a cold determination that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The reflected me reached for the door handle, and for those 3 impossible seconds, I watched as if I were witnessing my own future. A future where I walked out into the street with a weapon, and intent that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable. Then the 3 seconds passed, and I was still in my kitchen, knife hovering above half-chopped carrots. My hands shaking so badly I had to set the blade down before I cut myself. I stared at the mirror. My reflection stared back, now matching my position, now showing me in the kitchen where I actually stood. But something had changed in its eyes, a knowledge that it had shown me something, revealed something, and that revelation couldn't be taken back. The next divergence happened that very night. I'd been trying to sleep, the mirror covered but present, when I heard movement downstairs in the shop. My first thought was a break-in, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But as I crept down the stairs, I saw something that made me question whether I was still asleep and dreaming. Someone was moving through the shop floor, visible only in brief glimpses between the furniture and display cases. The figure was too far away, the light too dim, but something about its movement was achingly familiar. It moved like I moved, with the same slight limp in the left leg from an old injury, the same way of tilting its head when examining objects. I called out, my voice cracking. The figure stopped. Slowly it turned toward me, but a large wardrobe blocked my view of its face. We stood there in the darkness, predator and prey, though I couldn't say which role I occupied. My hand found the light switch. The shop blazed into fluorescence. Empty. Completely empty. Every door and window locked from the inside. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. I searched for 20 minutes, checking every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. The only movement in the entire shop came from me, reflected in a dozen antique mirrors, all showing me exactly where I stood, all except for Uncle Bartholomew's mirror upstairs, which I couldn't bring myself to uncover and check. I should have gotten rid of it then. Should have called someone, sold it, smashed it, anything. Instead, I found myself standing before it the next morning, blanket pulled away, studying every detail of its surface. The reflection showed my apartment, showed me standing in my sleeping clothes, but the room behind the reflected me was wrong. Subtly wrong. The furniture was arranged differently. The pictures on the walls were the same, but hung in different positions. And in the reflected apartment's corner, where my bed should have been, I could see the edge of something large covered with a sheet. Another mirror, perhaps, or a doorway to somewhere else. I reached toward the glass. My reflection reached back, but its timing was off by more than 3 seconds now. 5 seconds. 7. We were drifting further apart, my reflection and I, becoming separate entities connected by an increasingly tenuous thread of shared identity. That afternoon, a customer came in asking for me by name. Asking, she said, to return a purchase she'd made the day before. A Japanese chef's knife she claimed I'd sold her. I had no memory of the transaction, but there in her hand was a blade identical to mine, wrapped in the same paper I used, marked with my shop stamp. When I checked my records, there was the sale, logged in my handwriting, dated yesterday at 3:47 p.m. The timestamp corresponded exactly to when I'd been upstairs, having what I thought was a panic attack, the mirror covered, my eyes closed, trying to breathe through the anxiety that had been building for days. The customer seemed nervous, kept glancing around the shop as if expecting someone else to appear. She mentioned that something had been off about the transaction, that I had seemed different somehow, had barely spoken, had wrapped the knife with mechanical efficiency. She trailed off, leaving the uncomfortable thought unfinished, and practically fled when I told her to keep the knife. No refund necessary. I went upstairs. The mirror stood uncovered, though I distinctly remembered draping it before coming down. My reflection was missing from the glass. The frame showed only my apartment, empty, the furniture in those slightly wrong positions, the afternoon light coming from an angle that didn't match the actual sun's position. For 5 minutes, I stood before that mirror, waiting for my reflection to return, my heart beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. When the figure finally appeared, it approached the glass from deep within the reflected apartment, walking slowly, deliberately, its features obscured by shadow until it stood exactly where I stood. It was my face, but the eyes were all wrong. The expression was all wrong. This wasn't a reflection anymore, if it ever had been. This was something else, something that wore my features like a poorly fitted mask, something that had learned my movements and mannerisms by watching me through the glass, but hadn't quite mastered the soul behind them. The thing in the mirror smiled at me. I didn't smile back. That night I dreamed I was trapped inside the mirror, pressing against the glass from the inside, watching myself move through my apartment with that same mechanical efficiency, organizing my possessions, preparing for something. In the dream, I screamed and pounded on the glass, But my other self never looked back, never acknowledged my existence. When I woke, my hands were bruised and my throat was raw, and there were fingerprints on the inside of the mirror's glass, smudged and desperate, that hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. The police came by that afternoon. Routine questions, they said. Several neighbors had reported seeing someone matching my description in places where I shouldn't have been, at times that didn't align with where I claimed to be. A woman 3 blocks over mentioned someone who looked exactly like me had been standing in her backyard at midnight, just standing there, staring at her kitchen window. A bodega owner swore I'd come in at 4 in the morning, bought nothing, just walked through the aisles touching items with an expression he described as studying, like a scientist with lab rats. I had alibis for some of these sightings, but not all. Time had started slipping for me, hours passing in what felt like minutes, my memories full of gaps and inconsistencies. The officer's questions felt like they were coming from very far away, and I caught myself answering in a voice that didn't quite sound like mine, using words I didn't remember choosing. After they left, I climbed the stairs to my apartment with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The mirror waited, uncovered, always uncovered now, no matter how many times I draped it. The reflection showed me approaching, but I was approaching from a different angle than I actually walked. The 2 paths converged at the mirror's surface, 2 versions of the same person meeting at a membrane between worlds. I pressed my palm against the glass. Cold. So cold it burned. My reflection pressed back, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt another hand on the other side, felt the push of fingers that weren't my fingers, felt the pressure of something trying to come through while something else was being pulled in. The glass between us felt thinner than paper. That was 3 days ago. Or maybe it was 3 weeks. Time doesn't work right anymore. The mirror is always uncovered now, always showing me things I haven't done yet or did do but can't remember doing. I see myself in the shop below, interacting with customers I don't recall meeting. I see myself walking through streets I don't remember visiting. I see myself standing in strangers' yards at night, in parking lots at dawn, in the back rooms of other antique shops, always watching, always studying. Sometimes I try to leave the apartment, but I find myself stopping at the door, unable to remember why I wanted to go out. It's safer here, in this room, away from the world where my other self is walking around, learning to be me better than I ever was. The mirror shows me the truth now, without pretense. The reflected apartment is becoming more solid while mine grows dim and translucent. Objects in the reflection have weight and presence. Objects in my hands feel light and unreal, like stage props. I spend my days watching through the glass as my other self lives my life with disturbing competence. It runs the shop better than I did, smiles at customers with perfect warmth, maintains the books with meticulous care. No one seems to notice the difference. Or perhaps there is no difference anymore. Perhaps that thing was always me, and I was always just the reflection, the 3-second delay, the ghost image that was never quite real to begin with. Yesterday, or what I think was yesterday, I saw Uncle Bartholomew in the reflected shop. He stood in the corner where the mirror used to be, watching my other self with those watery gray eyes, a slight smile on his pale lips. He looked exactly as I remembered from those funeral encounters, except he seemed more solid than anything else in my fading world, more present, more real. He was also visible in my side of the mirror, standing in that same corner of my apartment, and when I turned to look directly at him, he was there, impossibly there, not 3 seconds delayed, but immediate and actual. He spoke to me then, his voice like wind through a crack in old wood, and he explained about the inheritance, about the mirror, about the choice that wasn't really a choice. He told me every reflection creates a debt, that every time we see ourselves in glass, we're making a copy that wants to be real, and given time and the right mirror, given the right conditions and the right weakness in the person standing before it, that copy will find a way through. Uncle Bartholomew was still talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore over the sound of my own breathing, which seemed to be coming from both sides of the mirror at once, mine and my reflections, synchronized at last after all this time out of sync. I'm writing this now in case someone finds it, though I'm not sure if these words are appearing on paper or on glass. The boundary between them has worn so thin. My other self is upstairs now. Or am I upstairs? The geography doesn't make sense anymore. We're approaching each other through our respective apartments, moving toward the mirror from opposite sides. And when we meet at the glass, I don't know which one of us will pass through, and which will remain trapped in the reflection. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we've both been trapped from the beginning, both reflections of something else that wore Uncle Bartholomew's face, that will wear mine next, that has been passing itself along through generations like a virus, spreading through the medium of mirrors and vanity and the human inability to look away from our own faces. The glass is so thin now I can barely tell which side I'm on. My reflection is reaching for the surface, and so am I, and our fingers are about to touch, and I can't tell anymore if I'm the one trying to escape or the one keeping someone else imprisoned. And maybe there was never any difference between us at all. Maybe we were always the same thing looking at itself from different angles. And maybe the mirror is gone, or I'm inside it, or both are true. Outside, through whatever window still exists in whatever world I currently occupy, I can see my other self leaving the shop, locking the door, walking down the street with perfect confidence. It's learned everything it needs to know. It's me now, or I'm it, or we were never separate to begin with. Behind me, in the reflected apartment that might be the real apartment, I can hear something moving in the rooms I can't see, something that sounds like footsteps, like breathing, like another reflection waking up and realizing it's been trapped, starting the cycle all over again. The mirror is still here. It's always here. And I'm standing before it, 3 seconds out of sync with myself, watching as my reflection writes these same words, watching as it realizes what I'm realizing, that the inheritance isn't the mirror at all. The inheritance is being the thing in the mirror. And Uncle Bartholomew is smiling in the corner, still watching, always watching, waiting to see which one of us will understand first that we're both already gone. I can see my reflection now, and it can see me, and we're both reaching for the glass, and we're both equally certain that we're the real one. And maybe that's the most terrifying truth of all, that there's no way to know, no test that can tell us which side of the mirror is the prison and which side is the world. The glass is breaking, or I'm breaking, or both are true, and somewhere, in some apartment that might be mine, or might be a reflection of mine, or might be neither, the mirror is waiting for the next person to stand before it, 3 seconds out of sync with their own life, counting down to the moment when they realize they've been moving through a reflection all along, that the real them passed through the glass long ago, and what remains is just an echo learning to pretend it was ever alive at all. Story 5. The tape arrived on a Thursday in a manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from somewhere in rural Oregon. I found it wedged between bills and promotional materials in the production studio mailbox, the kind of anonymous submission we received weekly from armchair detectives and conspiracy theorists. Most ended up in the trash. This one should have joined them. I'd been producing Echoes of Violence for 3 years, a true crime podcast that had grown from a side project into something approaching legitimate journalism. We specialized in cold cases from the 70s and 80s, the kind of stories that haunted small towns and never made it beyond local newspapers. The work was methodical, occasionally tedious, but there was satisfaction in giving voice to the forgotten. The envelope contained a single cassette tape, the plastic case cracked with age, and a handwritten note on yellowed paper. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Interview with subject, November 1979. Never released to public. Thought you might find this interesting for your show. No signature, no context, no explanation of how this person had obtained what appeared to be evidence from a decades-old investigation. I should have been more skeptical. Professional caution should have overridden curiosity, but we'd been struggling with content, and the allure of something genuinely undiscovered was too strong. I loaded the tape into our vintage player, the one we kept for archival material, and pressed play. Static filled the studio, a hissing blanket of white noise that seemed to press against my eardrums with unexpected pressure. Then a voice emerged, male, calm, conversational. The audio quality was poor, warped by time and degraded magnetic tape, but the words came through clearly enough. The speaker described his crimes with the detached precision of someone discussing a hobby, technical details delivered in a monotone that somehow made the content more disturbing than any theatrical affect could have achieved. I listened to the entire 43 minutes in the dimly lit studio, long after my co-host had left for the evening. There was something hypnotic about the recording, a quality I couldn't quite identify that kept pulling my attention back even when my mind wanted to wander. The voice seemed to exist in multiple registers simultaneously, the surface meaning clear but something else lurking beneath, like harmonics you feel more than hear. We aired the episode 2 weeks later, after I'd managed to verify through courthouse records that the speaker had indeed been a suspect in a series of crimes from that era, though he'd never been formally charged. The story fit our format perfectly. An unsolved mystery, a glimpse into a disturbed mind, and the tantalizing possibility of new information coming to light. I'd edited carefully, removing the most graphic descriptions while preserving the unsettling atmosphere of the original recording. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, our email and social media channels flooded with messages. Listener engagement had always been strong, but this was different. The messages weren't the usual speculation about suspects or praise for our research. They were reports. People claimed that after listening to the episode, they'd experienced phenomena in their homes. Objects displaced from where they'd been left. Electronics malfunctioning in coordinated patterns. The overwhelming sensation of being watched from spaces that should have been empty. What disturbed me most wasn't the volume of reports, but their consistency. Different listeners, scattered across continents, described identical experiences with an eerie precision that resisted dismissal as mass hysteria or coincidence. One message, from a listener in Vermont, described waking in the night to find every door in her apartment standing open, despite having locked them before bed. Another, from Australia, reported that his television had turned on by itself to static, the volume gradually increasing until it filled his apartment with white noise identical to the opening of our episode. A teacher in Japan wrote about coming home to find her furniture rearranged in a perfect circle, all pieces facing inward toward an empty center point. I tried to rationalize. Viral marketing had conditioned audiences to participate in collective narratives. People wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, and the human mind was remarkably skilled at manufacturing experiences to fit expected patterns. But the reports kept accumulating, and their specificity began to erode my skepticism. The first night I experienced it myself, I'd convinced myself that stress and lack of sleep were manufacturing false perceptions. I'd been working late in my apartment, reviewing listener messages, when the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The heating system should have been running, but the air carried a quality beyond mere cold, a thickness that seemed to resist my movements through it. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being observed, not the vague unease of imagined scrutiny, but the visceral certainty of another presence occupying space that should have been mine alone. My peripheral vision caught movement, shadows shifting in ways that didn't correspond to any light source. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there, but the impression of absence felt somehow worse than finding something tangible. I told myself it was suggestion, my mind primed by days of reading similar accounts, but that explanation felt increasingly hollow as the nights progressed. The phenomena escalated gradually, almost experimentally, as if something were learning the boundaries of what it could affect. Objects I'd left on my desk would migrate to different rooms. My laptop would wake from sleep mode to display static patterns I hadn't accessed. The apartment developed cold spots that moved rather than remaining stationary, always positioned just beyond my direct line of sight. My co-host noticed the deterioration before I did. She mentioned that I looked exhausted, that my focus during production meetings seemed scattered. When I tried to explain what had been happening, the words felt absurd, leaving my mouth. The narrative of a mind unraveling rather than anything approaching objective reality. She suggested gently that perhaps we should take the episode down, give the situation time to settle, let the viral fervor dissipate naturally. But the episode had already spread beyond our control. Listeners had downloaded it, shared it across platforms, embedded it in playlists and forums. Removing it from our official feed would accomplish nothing. The recording existed now in digital perpetuity, reproducing across servers and devices, played and replayed in bedrooms and cars and offices around the world. I became obsessed with understanding. If something was happening, there had to be a mechanism, a rational explanation that didn't require abandoning everything I understood about how reality functioned. I had the tape analyzed by an audio forensics expert, a friend from my journalism school days who owed me a favor. What she found made the situation exponentially worse. Beneath the audible conversation, embedded in frequencies below normal human hearing, the recording contained patterns, not random noise or equipment artifacts, but structured sequences that repeated throughout the 43 minutes. She showed me the spectrogram, peaks and valleys forming arrangements too precise to be accidental. The patterns synchronized with the speaker's words, creating a layered communication that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. She asked where I'd obtained the recording, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. When I couldn't provide a satisfactory answer, she suggested, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that I destroy every copy and never play it again, but she wouldn't explain why. Only that audio containing such patterns shouldn't exist, that the technology required to create them wouldn't have been available in 1979. That night, I listened to the original tape again, alone in the studio, headphones sealing me in with the voice and whatever else lurked in its frequencies. I needed to understand what I'd unleashed. The speaker's words took on new dimensions, meanings shifting depending on where I placed my attention. He spoke of doors and thresholds, of things that waited in spaces adjacent to our own, patient and eternal. His crimes, I realized, might have been less about the acts themselves than about creating specific conditions, arrangements of violence and fear that could thin the barriers between states of being. The understanding came with a visceral horror that bypassed rational thought entirely. Every time the episode played, those patterns propagated through the air and into the ears of listeners, each playback strengthening something that had been growing since 1979, perhaps longer. We hadn't discovered a recording. We'd activated a mechanism, turned a key in a lock that had been waiting decades to open. I tried to issue warnings, to tell listeners what we'd found, but the attempts felt futile. The episode had achieved a momentum beyond my ability to control. People shared it as a curiosity, as entertainment, as a participatory horror experience. Each new listener became another node in an expanding network, another aperture through which something could observe our world. The presence in my apartment grew bolder. I would wake to find myself standing in rooms I didn't remember entering, my body positioned in postures I hadn't chosen. The mirrors began showing reflections that didn't quite synchronize with my movements, delayed by fractions of seconds that stretched subjective time into uncomfortable new dimensions. Sounds filled the space, whispers in frequencies that existed just at the edge of perception. Words I couldn't quite distinguish but understood instinctively communicated meaning. My co-host stopped returning my calls. Friends expressed concern that escalated into distance when I couldn't moderate my intensity about the situation. Professional contacts suggested, with increasing directness, that I seek help. Their carefully diplomatic language unable to obscure their certainty that I was experiencing a psychological crisis rather than anything external. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the tape contained nothing but the confession of a disturbed man, and my mind had constructed elaborate frameworks to explain coincidence and exhaustion. Perhaps the only thing crossing thresholds was my sanity, eroding under the pressure of success and the weight of engaging with darkness for entertainment. But alone in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of presence that existed independent of my perception, I knew differently. Or I'd convinced myself so thoroughly of an unreality that the distinction no longer mattered. The cold spots had merged into territories, regions of space that felt fundamentally wrong, as if the geometry didn't quite align with the rest of the room. Shadows accumulated in corners despite adequate lighting, darkness that seemed to possess substance and intention. I can't stop listening to the tape. Every night I return to it, drawn by the same quality that first captured my attention, searching for understanding in the patterns that exist beneath the words. The voice has become familiar, almost comforting in its consistency, a guide through territories my mind wasn't meant to navigate. The latest reports describe listeners seeing figures in their periphery, presences that disappear when confronted directly, but leave impressions of mass and intention. The descriptions match what I've been experiencing, confirming either the reality of what's happening or the contagious nature of delusion. I'm no longer certain which possibility terrifies me more. Tonight, as I sit in the darkness of my studio, surrounded by equipment that hums with power and purpose, I understand that it no longer matters whether I believe. The episode plays somewhere at every moment, propagating across time zones and platforms, each playback strengthening the connection between what exists here and what waits elsewhere. I can feel it growing, patient and inevitable, approaching a threshold I helped create but cannot control. The tape is playing now, for perhaps the 1000th time, the voice describing doors and spaces between with an intimacy that suggests first-hand knowledge. And in the darkness beyond my monitors, where light should reach but somehow doesn't, something is learning to hold its shape. It doesn't need my belief to exist. It only needs to be heard. I should stop the recording, power down the equipment, walk away from what I've helped create. But my hand remains motionless on the desk, and the voice continues speaking. And in the cold darkness of the studio, I'm no longer certain which side of the threshold I'm standing on. Story 6. The first thing I noticed about Willow Creek was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a neighborhood after dark, but something thicker, more deliberate. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, of the blood rushing through your ears. My wife and I stood in front of our new home, a pristine colonial with shutters the exact shade of cream as every other house on the cul-de-sac, and I felt that silence wrap around us like a hand closing into a fist. The realtor had called it a gem of a community. Gated, secure, affordable. The kind of place young professionals dream about. What she hadn't mentioned was how the afternoon sun seemed to hang at the same angle for hours, or how the grass looked so uniform it might have been painted on. We'd barely started unloading boxes when they came. The neighbors, all of them at once it seemed, emerging from identical doorways with identical casserole dishes wrapped in identical checkered cloth. They smiled as they approached, those broad grins that showed too many teeth, and I felt my wife's hand tighten around my arm. The woman from number 7 introduced herself, though her name slipped from my mind the moment she spoke it. She had that ageless quality some suburban women cultivate. Could have been 35 or 55. Her smile never wavered as she told us how wonderful it was to have new neighbors, how perfect we would fit in, how we'd never want to leave. The words tumbled out in a rehearsed rhythm, like a speech she'd given 1,000 times before. The others echoed her sentiment. Same cadence, same inflection, same phrases about perfection and belonging and never leaving. When they finally retreated to their homes, my wife turned to me with something frightened in her eyes. "Did you notice?" she started, but I cut her off with a kiss on the forehead, told her we were just tired from the move, that small towns were like this, friendly, close-knit. I didn't mention that I'd noticed too, or that the casseroles they'd left behind were all the same dish, down to the arrangement of cheese on top. The first week passed in a fog of unpacking and forced normalcy. Every morning at exactly 7:15, I'd hear our neighbors' doors opening in sequence. 7:15, 7:16, 7:17, clockwork precision. They'd emerge in their pristine business casual, climb into their sedans, and drive off. Every evening at 6:30, they'd return in reverse order. 6:30, 6:29, 6:28. My wife started keeping track on the third day. She'd stand at the window with her coffee, watching, counting. I told her to stop, told her she was seeing patterns where there were none. But I'd started noticing things too. The way our neighbor from number 11 always wore blue on Mondays, green on Tuesdays, yellow on Wednesdays. The way the couple from number 9 held hands at precisely the same angle when they walked their dog, a golden retriever that never barked, never pulled at the leash, never did anything but walk in a perfect heel. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, or rather, the absence of them. No late-night television bleeding through walls, no arguments, no laughter. Just that same heavy silence, broken only by the hum of air conditioning units that all seemed to cycle on and off in unison. The dreams started around day 10. I'd find myself walking down our street in darkness so complete I couldn't see my own hands. The houses loomed on either side, and from behind every window, I could feel eyes watching. Not hostile exactly, more like a scientist observing a lab rat. Clinical, patient, waiting for something. I'd always wake at 3:33. Always. My wife would be beside me, her breathing shallow and quick, and I knew she'd been having the same dreams. We never talked about them. Talking would make them real. The Homeowners Association meeting was scheduled for our second Friday. Attendance was mandatory. They'd informed us through a cream-colored card slipped under our door. The handwriting was perfect. Too perfect. Like a computer font pretending to be human. The meeting took place in the community center, a building I didn't remember seeing during our tour of the neighborhood. It sat at the dead center of the development, equidistant from every home, its windows reflecting the evening sky in a way that made it difficult to look at directly. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows. Every seat was filled except for 2 in the front row, our designated spots, with name cards in that same unsettlingly perfect handwriting. As we sat, I became acutely aware of the eyes on our backs. Dozens of them. Hundreds. I forced myself not to turn around. The association president stood at the podium, and I struggled to focus on his face. Not because of poor lighting, the fluorescents overhead were brutally bright, but because his features seemed to shift every time I blinked. Sometimes his nose was larger, sometimes his eyes were a different color, but his smile remained constant, that same too-wide expression I'd seen on every face in Willow Creek. He spoke about regulations, about conformity, about the importance of maintaining standards. The words washed over me in waves of meaninglessness, but underneath them, I heard something else, a rhythm, a pulse, like a heartbeat that didn't quite match my own. My wife's hand found mine in the darkness of my peripheral vision. Her palm was slick with sweat. She leaned close and whispered something I couldn't quite make out over the president's drone, but I felt the urgency in her breath against my ear. When I turned to ask her to repeat it, her eyes were fixed on something behind the podium. There was a door back there. Not a regular door. This one was older, heavier, made of wood that looked almost black in the fluorescent light. I hadn't noticed it before, and I had the distinct impression I wasn't supposed to notice it now. But once I'd seen it, I couldn't look away. The meeting ended abruptly. One moment the president was speaking, the next everyone was standing, filing out in orderly lines, their movements synchronized like a dance they'd rehearsed. My wife and I remained seated, frozen, until we were alone in the room except for the president, who stood by the exit with his hand on the light switch. "First meetings can be overwhelming," he said, his voice somehow coming from both in front of us and behind us simultaneously. "You'll adjust. Everyone does." We drove home in silence. Not a comfortable silence, the kind pregnant with words that neither of us wanted to speak first. In our driveway, my wife finally said what we'd both been thinking. We should leave. I agreed immediately, too immediately, as if the words had been waiting in my throat, ready to escape the moment given permission. We'd pack that night, I said. Leave before dawn. Drive until Willow Creek was just a strange memory we could eventually laugh about. But when we stepped inside our house, exhaustion hit like a physical force. Our limbs were heavy, our thoughts syrupy and slow. My wife suggested we rest first, just for an hour. I found myself nodding, following her upstairs, falling into bed with my shoes still on. The dreams were worse this time. I walked through that same darkness, but now the houses on either side had opened up, their walls peeling back like flower petals. Inside each one I could see figures, human-shaped but wrong somehow, their movements too fluid, their joints bending in directions they shouldn't. They all turned to look at me as I passed, and their faces were mirrors, reflecting my own expression of mounting horror back at me infinitely. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Morning. We'd overslept. My wife was already up, standing at the window, still in yesterday's clothes. "We need to go," she said without turning around. Right now. We threw essentials into bags, moving with the frantic energy of people who'd woken up late for something important. Toiletries, clothes, documents. None of it mattered really. We just needed to be moving, doing, escaping. My hands shook as I grabbed the car keys. The garage door opener didn't work. I pressed it again. Again. Nothing. My wife was already heading for the front door, and I followed, bags in hand, ready to throw everything in the car manually and just go. But when we opened the front door, the president of the Homeowners Association was standing on our porch. His smile was wider than before, if that was possible. He held a covered dish. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. "But you've only just arrived. We made you breakfast." The sky behind him was the wrong color. Too blue. Too saturated. Like someone had turned up the contrast on reality itself. I tried to push past him, but he didn't move. Didn't even sway. It was like trying to move a wall. "You should eat," he said. "Keep your strength up. It's a big day today." "What day?" The question came out of my wife before she could stop herself. His smile somehow widened further. "Moving day, of course. For everyone." We tried the back door, the windows. Every exit was blocked, not physically, but by that same invisible resistance, like the air itself had solidified. Through the windows, I could see our neighbors emerging from their homes in that same sequential pattern. 7:15, 7:16, 7:17. But instead of getting into their cars, they were walking. All of them. Moving in a slow, synchronized march toward the center of the development, toward the community center. My wife grabbed my hand and pulled me upstairs, as if height could somehow provide escape. From the second-floor window, we watched the procession, perfect lines of perfect people moving with perfect synchronicity. And as they walked, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. They weren't touching the ground, not quite. There was a gap, almost imperceptible between their shoes and the pavement. They were gliding, floating, moving like puppets on invisible strings. "The basement," my wife said suddenly. "The community center. I saw stairs. Behind that door." I knew what she was thinking. That if we could understand what was happening, we could fight it. That knowledge was power. But I also knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in my chest, that some knowledge wasn't meant for human minds. Still, what choice did we have? We waited until the procession had passed, then slipped out through the garage, which opened easily now as if it had never been stuck. The streets were empty. The houses stood silent, their windows like blank eyes. Above us, that too blue sky pressed down like a lid on a jar. The community center's main entrance was unlocked. Inside, that same fluorescent brightness, that same unsettling cleanness. The building was empty, but I could hear sounds from below. Rhythmic, mechanical, like breathing, but on a massive scale. The door behind the podium stood open now, practically inviting us in. Stone steps descended into darkness, and from the bottom rose a smell I couldn't quite identify. Something chemical and organic at once, like formaldehyde mixed with something sweeter, more rotten. My wife went first. I followed, one hand on the wall for balance. The stone was warm beneath my fingers, and I could feel it pulsing in rhythm with that breathing sound. The basement was enormous, larger than the building above it, which should have been impossible. The ceiling stretched up and up, disappearing into shadows the fluorescent lights couldn't penetrate. And along the walls, in rows that seemed to go on forever, were bodies. Hundreds of them, thousands, preserved in some kind of clear substance, their faces frozen in expressions of perfect contentment, perfect happiness. They looked like they were sleeping, except their eyes were open, staring at nothing with pupils that caught the light and reflected it back in colors that didn't exist. And their smiles. God, their smiles. The same smile I'd seen on every face in Willow Creek. The same smile that was probably spreading across my own face at that very moment without my permission. My wife walked along the rows, her hand trailing along the clear substance that held the bodies. They were arranged by date, I realized. Tags beneath each one marking when they'd been, preserved? Replaced? The dates went back decades, centuries maybe. The oldest ones had clothing from eras I couldn't quite place, but all of them had that same smile. At the end of the final row, 2 spaces stood empty, prepared, waiting. Above them, tags with our names in that perfect inhuman handwriting. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind us, slow, unhurried. The president descended with that same floating gait, his smile never wavering. "You found it," he said, and his voice held no surprise. "Most don't make it this far. Most accept the change peacefully. But every few cycles we get ones like you. Curious, resistant. It makes the transition more interesting." My wife pressed herself against me and I felt her whole body trembling. Or was that my own shaking? I couldn't tell anymore where I ended and she began. "What is this?" I managed to ask. "What are you?" The president tilted his head in a motion that was almost human. Almost. "We're the neighborhood," he said simply. "And soon so will you be. Everyone joins eventually. Everyone becomes perfect. Everyone stays." He took a step forward and I felt that same invisible resistance. That same solidification of air. My limbs grew heavy. My thoughts slowed. I could feel something at the edges of my consciousness, pressing in, trying to reshape me into something else. Something that would smile forever and never wonder why. The last thing I remember clearly is my wife's hand in mine, squeezing so hard I thought bones might break. Then the world dissolved into that too bright fluorescence, and I felt myself splitting. Part of me still human, still screaming, and part of me spreading out, becoming one with whatever vast thing lived beneath Willow Creek. I'm writing this now from our house. It's morning. 7:15. The sun hangs at that same perfect angle, casting shadows that never quite look right. My wife is downstairs making coffee, humming something tuneless. In a few minutes, we'll get in our car and drive to jobs I can't quite remember having. Tonight we'll return at 6:30, eat dinner in front of a television that shows programs I forget the moment they end, and go to bed at exactly 9:30. Everything is perfect here. Everyone is happy. The neighbors wave when they see us, and we wave back, our movements synchronized like a dance we've rehearsed forever. My face hurts from smiling, but I can't seem to stop. Sometimes, late at night when that perfect sleep eludes me for a few precious seconds, I try to remember what came before. I try to recall a time when we wanted to leave, when we saw something in a basement that made us understand. But those memories slip away like water through fingers, leaving only the certainty that we're exactly where we're supposed to be. I'm writing this now because some part of me, some small, shrinking part that hasn't been absorbed yet, knows that I need to warn whoever comes next. The new couple moving into number 14, the family scheduled for number 6. I want to tell them to run, to never unpack, to ignore the casseroles and the smiles and the promise of perfection. But I won't. When they arrive, I'll be standing on their porch with a covered dish and that same too-wide smile, telling them how wonderful it is to have new neighbors, how perfect they'll fit in, how they'll never want to leave. Because I don't want to leave anymore. None of us do. And soon, neither will they. The only question that keeps me awake, in those brief moments before sleep claims me at exactly 9:30, is whether I'm writing this as a warning or as an invitation. Whether I'm still the person who discovered the basement, or if I've become the thing we found down there. I don't know anymore. I don't think I want to know. But I do know that there are 2 empty spaces waiting in that basement, and every day the substance in those containers rises a little higher, like glasses being filled, preparing for occupants that are overdue. And I know that tomorrow morning, my wife and I will wake at 7 o'clock, the same as we do every morning. We'll go through our perfect routine in our perfect house in our perfect neighborhood, and if we're lucky, if there's still enough human left in us, we won't remember why we're smiling. Story 7. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, clinical and impersonal, informing me that my recent genetic screening through HelixCore had revealed certain anomalies requiring immediate follow-up. The words swam on my phone screen as I sat in my apartment, coffee cooling in my hand. Anomalies. That word alone carried enough weight to crush the mundane rhythm of my morning routine. I'd taken the test 3 months prior, swept up in the trend of genetic ancestry mapping that everyone seemed obsessed with lately. Send in your saliva, discover your heritage, learn about health predispositions. Simple, harmless. The kind of thing you do without thinking about consequences because there aren't supposed to be any. The follow-up appointment was scheduled for that afternoon. No option to decline, no option to postpone. The HelixCore facility occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, all sterile white surfaces, and the particular silence that comes from sound-dampening panels in the walls. Dr. Vance met me in a consultation room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, something organic I couldn't quite place. He was younger than I expected, with the kind of precise movements that suggested military training or obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He explained that my genetic profile contained markers they'd never seen before. Dormant sequences, he called them. Ancient code buried in the spiraling ladder of my DNA. He used words like non-human origin and pre-Holocene expression, while I sat there trying to understand how something in my blood could be older than civilization itself. When I asked what it meant, what would happen, he simply said they needed to monitor me, that the markers might activate, that I wasn't alone in carrying them. Approximately 3% of the population shared this particular legacy. The word legacy stuck with me as I left, echoing in my skull during the elevator descent. That night, I dreamed of water. Not the water of oceans or rivers, but something thicker, darker, pressing against my skin from all sides. In the dream, I couldn't tell if I was drowning or breathing. The distinction seemed irrelevant. When I surfaced into consciousness, my sheets were soaked through with sweat, and my bedroom window was open despite the October cold. I never opened that window. Never. The gaps began small, minutes at first, then hours. I'd be working at my laptop and suddenly it would be dark outside, my screen showing searches I didn't remember conducting. Paleontology sites, extinction events, images of creatures from the Cambrian era, all segments and alien symmetry. My browser history became a stranger's timeline, chronicling an obsession I didn't consciously possess. My apartment started feeling wrong. The proportions seemed subtly off, as if the walls had shifted an inch inward when I wasn't looking. The air grew heavier, acquiring that organic scent from the HelixCore facility, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid it. At night, I could hear something moving in the walls. Not rats. The sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something breathing in synchronization with my own lungs. Dr. Vance called weekly. The conversations followed a script. How was I feeling? Any unusual symptoms? Any memory lapses? I told him about the dreams, about waking up in places I didn't remember going to. He made notes with that same precise efficiency, never quite meeting my eyes, and assured me it was all expected. Part of the process, he said. The process. As if I'd agreed to something beyond that initial saliva sample. The morning I woke up covered in blood, I stopped pretending everything was manageable. It wasn't my blood. I checked myself frantically, finding no wounds, no explanation. But it coated my hands, my arms, dried into the creases of my palms and under my fingernails. The metallic smell filled my nostrils, thick and nauseating. My apartment looked like a crime scene, though there was no body, no victim, just destruction. Furniture overturned, claw marks gouged deep into the hardwood floor, and a trail of that blood leading from my bedroom to the bathroom, where I stood staring at my reflection. My eyes looked different. The color was wrong, pupils too dilated, and for just a moment, I saw something else looking back at me from behind my face, something ancient and patient. I scrubbed myself raw in the shower, watching pink water circle the drain, and tried to piece together the previous night. Nothing. just a void where 12 hours should have been, a blank space in my existence that terrified me more than the blood. Helix Corps sent a cleaning crew that afternoon. They arrived without me calling them, as if they'd been monitoring my apartment, waiting for this exact scenario. They worked in silence, efficient and thorough, removing all evidence of whatever had happened. Dr. Vance came with them, setting up equipment in my living room, cameras, sensors, devices whose purpose I couldn't guess at. He explained that the monitoring needed to be more intensive now, that I'd entered what he called the active phase, that I should consider myself fortunate to be part of something unprecedented. I didn't feel fortunate. I felt observed. The cameras caught nothing useful, or at least nothing they shared with me, but I started recording myself on my phone, propping it up before I slept, hoping to capture what my conscious mind couldn't retain. The footage showed me sleeping peacefully for hours, then nothing, pure static, as if something had corrupted the files precisely when events occurred. Every single recording ended the same way. White noise and visual snow consuming the image at the exact moment I would have been doing whatever it was I couldn't remember. My skin began to change. Subtle at first. Patches of roughness along my forearms, a strange texture like scale patterns just beneath the surface. When I touched these areas, they felt hot, feverish, as if something was trying to push through from inside. I wore long sleeves constantly, even as summer approached, hiding the transformation that might have been real, or might have been my mind fracturing under the weight of sleep deprivation and fear. Dr. Vance's visits increased. He brought others now, colleagues who examined me with clinical detachment, taking samples, running tests, speaking in low voices about activation percentages and genetic expression timelines. One of them, a woman whose name tag read Dr. Novak, let slip something that made my blood freeze. She mentioned others like me, dozens scattered across the city, all entering their active phases simultaneously, all being monitored, all changing. I started seeing them everywhere, or I thought I did. People on the street who moved wrong, whose proportions seemed subtly alien, who watched me with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much ancientness. I couldn't tell anymore if I was recognizing fellow carriers of whatever slept in our DNA, or if I was simply losing my grip on reality, assigning significance to random strangers because my mind needed a pattern to cling to. The dreams intensified. I was something else in them now, something that had existed when the world was younger and stranger. I moved through prehistoric seas, through landscapes that had no name in any modern language. The memories felt more real than my waking life, more solid, and I began to wonder which state was the dream and which was the truth. One night, I woke up in the forest outside the city, naked, covered in mud and what might have been blood, or might have been something else entirely. My phone was dead, my apartment 15 miles away, and I had no memory of how I'd gotten there. The sun was rising, painting the trees in shades of red that seemed wrong, too vivid, too alive. As I walked back toward civilization, I felt eyes on me from the shadows between the trees. Not human eyes. Something else. Something watching the slow transformation with interest and perhaps recognition. Dr. Vance was waiting at my apartment when I finally made it back. He didn't seem surprised by my condition, didn't ask questions about where I'd been. Instead, he told me the truth, or his version of it. Helix Corps wasn't just discovering these genetic markers, they were activating them, deliberately. Through proprietary methods he wouldn't explain, they were waking up something that had been dormant for millions of years, buried in the genetic code of 3% of humanity. Not a random 3%, a chosen 3%. He spoke of cycles, of species that had dominated Earth before humans, of DNA as a time capsule carrying the imprint of extinct civilizations. He explained that we, the carriers, weren't degenerating or transforming into something random. We were remembering. Our bodies were accessing genetic memories, reverting to previous forms, becoming what we had been before we were forced into this soft, vulnerable shape called human. The company wanted to study the process because they believed the ancient species was waking up, not just in individuals, but collectively. A distributed consciousness spread across 3% of the human population, using our bodies as vessels for its return. Helicet's core thought they could control it, understand it, maybe even profit from it. They thought they were scientists conducting an experiment. They were wrong. We weren't the experiment. We were the invasion. I listened to him explain this, standing in my apartment that no longer felt like mine, and I realized he was afraid. Despite his clinical detachment, despite the equipment and the protocols and the carefully managed monitoring, Dr. Vance was terrified. He'd unleashed something he couldn't contain, and now it was too late to stop. The transformations came faster after that conversation. I'd lose hours, then days. Time became fluid, unreliable. I'd be at my computer and blink into existence somewhere else. The roof of my building, the basement laundry room, once in the middle of traffic on the highway with no memory of getting there. Each time I'd find evidence of what I'd been doing. Strange patterns drawn in substances I didn't want to identify. Objects arranged in configurations that hurt to look at. Messages written in languages that predated writing itself. My reflections stopped making sense. Some mornings I'd look in the mirror and see myself as I'd always been. Other mornings, the thing looking back was fundamentally other, wearing my face like an ill-fitting mask. The worst mornings were when I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The others started appearing, fellow carriers drawn to my location by instincts neither they nor I could articulate. We'd find ourselves in the same spaces, abandoned buildings, parks after dark, the concrete spaces beneath bridges where the city's geometry created pockets of shadow. We didn't speak. Language seemed unnecessary. We understood each other through older means, through the genetic memory that was overwriting our individual identities. Helicet's core tried to intervene, tried to separate us, but they were operating with human logic against something that had been adapting to this planet for epochs before humans existed. Their facilities became gathering points. Their monitoring equipment recorded things they couldn't explain, and probably wished they hadn't witnessed. Dr. Vance stopped calling. The monitoring equipment remained in my apartment, but no one came to check the data anymore. I think they'd given up trying to understand what they'd started. Or maybe they'd finally grasped that they were never in control, that they'd simply accelerated something inevitable. Now I sit in my apartment, watching the sunset through windows that might not be real anymore. My hands look human, but sometimes I feel the memory of claws, of appendages designed for a world that exists in parallel to this one. The city continues outside, oblivious to the fact that 3% of its population is becoming something else. Something that remembers when this land was ocean floor, when the air was different, when humanity was millions of years from its first thought. I don't know if I'm going insane or waking up. I don't know if the changes are real, or if my mind is simply fracturing under the weight of suggestion and corporate manipulation. Some nights I think Helicet's core created an elaborate psychological experiment, that the genetic markers are fiction designed to make us believe we're transforming. Other nights, I know with absolute certainty that I'm shedding an evolutionary prison, returning to what I was always meant to be. The truth might be both, or neither. What I know for certain is this: I am not alone. We are not alone. And something that has been waiting for millions of years is finally ready to reclaim what was always rightfully ours. Whether we're victims or willing participants, whether this is evolution or invasion, madness or metamorphosis, these distinctions matter only to the part of me that's still human, and that part is shrinking. Each time I lose hours and wake up somewhere unexpected, I find that I mind less. The gaps in my memory feel less like loss and more like liberation. The changes in my body feel less like horror and more like homecoming. The eyes watching from the shadows feel less like threat and more like kin. Tonight, as I write this, I can feel another episode coming. The familiar pressure building behind my eyes, the heat in my skin, the sense of my consciousness preparing to step aside for something older and infinitely more patient. I used to fight it. Now I'm not sure I want to. Maybe Dr. Vance was right. Maybe we are part of something unprecedented. Maybe humanity was always just a temporary arrangement, a placeholder species keeping the planet warm until its true inheritors were ready to return. Or maybe I'm just a man losing his mind, fed lies by a corporation with motives I'll never understand, transforming nothing but my own sanity as I spiral into psychosis. I'll never know for certain, but tomorrow morning, when I wake up covered in something that might be blood, might be something else entirely, in a place I don't remember going, having done things I can't recall, I suspect I'll care less and less about the distinction. The monitoring equipment blinks red in the corner of my vision. Recording. Always recording. But I wonder now, who's really being studied? Who's really being transformed? Who's really in control? The sun completes its descent. Darkness pools in the corners of my apartment, and somewhere deep in my DNA, something ancient stirs, remembers, and begins to wake. Story 8. The advertisement appeared on my phone at 3:47 a.m., glowing in the darkness of my bedroom like a promise I didn't know I needed. Unlock your lost memories. Recall tech, where yesterday meets tomorrow. I should have deleted it. I should have rolled over and surrendered to sleep. Instead, I tapped the screen. The download took 47 seconds. I counted each one, watching the progress bar fill with an electric blue that seemed too bright, too alive for that dead hour. The interface opened immediately. No tutorial, no explanation. Just a simple question pulsing in white text. What do you want to remember? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The apartment around me felt hollow, the silence pressing against my eardrums like water. I typed, childhood, ages 7 to 12. The app asked me to attach the neural stimulation nodes, small adhesive patches that arrived the next morning in packaging so generic it could have contained anything. Or nothing at all. The first session lasted 30 minutes. I sat in my desk chair, the nodes cool against my temples, and closed my eyes as instructed. The hum started low, almost below hearing, a vibration that resonated in my teeth and the back of my skull. Colors bloomed behind my eyelids, not the random static of closed eyes, but structured patterns, geometric and deliberate. Then the memories came. I remembered the house on Pemberton Street with its yellow siding, and the oak tree that dropped acorns like small bombs every autumn. I remembered my father's workshop in the garage, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, the way sunlight slanted through the single window and made everything look ancient and holy. These were good memories, warm ones, and I felt something unknot in my chest that I hadn't realized was twisted, but there was something else underneath them. A shadow, a shape moving just beyond the edge of what I could see. The second session came 3 days later. I'd been thinking about those memories constantly, turning them over in my mind like smooth stones, examining every detail. The app suggested I go deeper, explore more specific moments. I agreed. The nodes went on, the hum began, and this time the memories came faster, sharper, more real than reality itself. I was 10 years old standing in the garage. My father was showing me how to use the table saw, his calloused hand guiding mine, his voice patient and low. But as the memory played, I noticed details that felt wrong. The light through the window was too red, too much like sunset, though I remembered it being morning. And there was someone else in the garage, a figure in the corner, watching us. When I tried to look directly at them, the memory fragmented, scattered like startled birds. I opened my eyes. My hands were shaking. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different now, as if someone had moved everything an inch to the left while I wasn't looking. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be at 2 in the afternoon. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the garage, standing so still it might have been a coat on a hook or a pile of tools. Might have been, but wasn't. The third session happened because I needed answers. The app had a message waiting for me when I opened it. New memories available. Enhanced recall protocol activated. I didn't remember authorizing any enhanced protocol, but the curiosity was a hook in my chest pulling tight. I attached the nodes. I closed my eyes. The hum rose to a pitch that made my molars ache. This time the memory was different. Wrong. I was in a basement I'd never seen before. Concrete walls weeping moisture, a single bulb swinging from a frayed cord. Someone was with me. Not the figure from before, but someone real, someone terrified. I could hear them breathing, fast and shallow, could smell their fear like copper and salt. And I was doing something terrible. My hands in the memory were covered in red. The walls were marked with patterns I couldn't quite parse. And worst of all, I could feel the satisfaction, the pleasure. It wasn't my emotion, but it was in my body, in my head, as real as my own heartbeat. I tore the nodes off. The memory didn't stop. It kept playing behind my eyes, even when I opened them. I stumbled to the bathroom and vomited, the taste of acid and terror mixing with something that felt like guilt for a crime I'd never committed. When I finally looked up at the mirror, there was red under my fingernails. Faint, barely visible, but there. I scrubbed my hands until they were raw. The red stayed, lodged in the lines of my skin like it had always been there, like it belonged. The news broke 2 days later. A woman, they didn't give her name, just called her a local resident, had been found in her apartment in a state the reporters described as catatonic, unresponsive. The strange part was the basement. She had no basement in her building, but first responders reported finding evidence of something in the crawl space beneath her unit. Markings on the walls. The details were vague, carefully worded, but I recognized them, the same patterns from my memory. I checked the app. It showed my session history, timestamps, duration, nothing unusual. But when I scrolled to the details of that third session, there was an address attached, the same address from the news report. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring through to voicemail. My hand clenched so tight around the device I thought I might crack the screen. The voicemail notification appeared immediately. I played it on speaker, volume low, as if that would make it less real. Static, heavy breathing. Then a voice, distorted and wrong. You remember what you did? We all do. The memories are spreading. I deleted the app, or tried to. The icon wouldn't respond to my touch. When I went into settings to uninstall it manually, it wasn't listed. But it was still there on my home screen, pulsing softly, like a living thing. The nodes were still in my apartment. I'd thrown them away, watched the garbage truck take them, but they reappeared on my bedside table the next morning, the adhesive backing pristine, unused. I burned them in the sink. They were back by evening. More news reports came in a cascade over the following days. 5 people, then 8, then 12. All users of recall tech. All found in similar states, locked in their own minds, surrounded by evidence of crimes that defied explanation. The victims, if they were victims, showed no physical harm, but their brains showed unusual activity patterns. Doctors called it unprecedented. Neuroscientists called it impossible. The media called it mass hysteria. But I knew better. I could feel it happening to me. New memories surfaced every day, unbidden, unwanted. Memories of places I'd never been, of actions I'd never taken. Each one came with sensory details so vivid they overwrote my actual experiences. I started losing track of what was real. Had I ever actually lived on Pemberton Street? Or was that another implant, another fiction? The more I tried to separate truth from fabrication, the more everything blurred together. I stopped leaving my apartment. The outside world felt hostile, accusatory. People looked at me differently, or maybe they always had, and I was only now noticing. Every siren made my pulse spike. Every knock on the door sent me into a panic that left me breathless and shaking. The app sent me notifications constantly now. New memory available, new memory available, new memory available. I turned off my phone. The notifications appeared on my laptop. I shut that down. They showed up on my television screen, scrolling across the black glass like subtitles to a show I wasn't watching. Then Detective Irving showed up. Tall woman with sharp eyes and a skeptical mouth. She stood in my doorway asking questions about my whereabouts on specific dates. about my relationship with people whose names meant nothing to me. She showed me photographs, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. But in some of them, caught in the background or reflected in windows, there was a figure that looked like me. Not exactly me, but close enough. She asked about recall tech, asked if I'd experienced any unusual symptoms. I told her I'd deleted the app, tried to laugh it off as a strange fad I'd briefly tried. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she handed me a card with her number and told me to call if I remembered anything. The word remembered hung in the air between us like a threat. After she left, I went back to my computer. The app was open, though I hadn't touched it in days. There was a new message waiting. Memory integration, 87% complete. Thank you for your participation in the Collective Recall Initiative. Collective. The word made something cold slide down my spine. I researched everything I could find about recall tech. The company had no physical address, no registered employees, no legitimate business registration. It had appeared simultaneously in dozens of countries 3 months ago. The user agreement, which I'd never read, contained clauses about shared neural mapping and distributed memory networks. Terms I didn't understand, but that sounded wrong, fundamentally wrong. The theory I found on obscure forums was worse than anything I'd imagined. The app wasn't recovering memories. It was creating a network, a collective consciousness built from harvested experiences and artificial constructs. Every user became both source and recipient. The crimes in the false memories weren't predictions or implants. They were distributed actions, carried out by the network itself through its users, who would remember committing them but couldn't separate the memory from their own identity. We were all guilty. We were all innocent. The distinction had ceased to matter. My phone rang again. Detective Irving. I let it go to voicemail. Listened to her message asking me to come to the station, saying they needed to clear up some inconsistencies in my statement. Her voice was professional, but underneath I heard something else. Certainty. She thought I'd done something, and maybe I had. In some version of events, in some distributed memory, I was guilty. The nodes appeared in my hand. I didn't remember picking them up. They felt warm, almost alive, and my fingers moved on their own, attaching them to my temples. The hum began before I could stop it, rising to that familiar pitch that resonated in my bones. This memory was different. I was standing in my own apartment, looking at myself sitting in the desk chair, nodes attached, eyes closed, watching myself from the outside, as if I were the figure that had been lurking in all my other memories. And as I watched, I saw myself smile. An expression I'd never worn, never would wear. Saw my hands reach for something. Saw myself stand and walk toward the door with purpose and certainty. The memory ended. I opened my eyes. The apartment was dark. I didn't remember the sun setting, didn't remember hours passing. But my clothes were different now, and there was dirt under my fingernails. Real dirt, not the red that wouldn't wash away. And on my coffee table, there was a key I'd never seen before. The key was labeled with an address, not mine. I checked the news on my phone. A new case had broken an hour ago. Another recall tech user found unresponsive. Same address as the key. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called Detective Irving. No answer. Tried again. The call went straight to voicemail. On my third attempt, someone else picked up. A male voice, tired and wary, identified himself as her partner. He asked where I was, asked if I was alone, told me to stay where I was, that someone would be coming to help me. Help me. The words rang false. I looked at the key again, looked at my hands, the dirt, the clothes I couldn't remember changing into, and I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that I had no way of knowing which version of events was real. Had I gone somewhere? Done something? Or was this another implanted memory? Another false experience designed to make me believe in my own guilt? The app opened on my phone without me touching it. A new message. Final integration in progress. Thank you for your service to the network. Your memories are now everyone's. Everyone's memories are now yours. I understood then. The app hadn't just implanted false memories. It had dissolved the boundaries between individuals entirely. Somewhere in the network, someone had committed crimes. Multiple someones. And now those memories belonged to all of us. We were all perpetrators, all witnesses, all victims. The physical evidence appeared because the network needed it to, because enough people remembered it existing that reality itself bent to accommodate the collective delusion. Or maybe it was never a delusion. Maybe the crimes were real, distributed across dozens of users who carried them out in fugue states, remembered them later, and couldn't separate the memory from their authentic experiences. Maybe I had been to that address. Maybe my hands had done those terrible things. Maybe the version of me that committed them was as real as the version sitting here now, trying to make sense of impossible evidence. There's a knock at my door. Patient. Persistent. I don't move to answer it. The key is still on my table, the nodes are still warm against my skin, and somewhere in my mind, I can feel other memories trying to surface. Other crimes, other victims, other versions of myself that I can't quite access but know are there, waiting. The knocking continues. A voice calls my name through the door. It might be Detective Irving. It might be someone else. It might be another version of me, coming to collect what I've done, or what I'm about to do, or what I'll remember doing tomorrow. I pick up the nodes one last time, weighing them in my palm. The apartment is very quiet except for that persistent knocking. If I use them again, I might understand. Might remember what really happened. Might finally know which memories are mine and which belong to the network. Or I might disappear entirely into the collective. Become just another node in the system. My sense of self dissolving like sugar in water, until there's no distinction between what I did and what others did, and what we all remember happening. The knocking has stopped. The silence is worse. I can hear breathing on the other side of the door, or maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I'm already gone, already integrated, and this moment is just another memory being created, distributed, experienced by dozens of users who will wake tomorrow believing they lived through this exact fear. I close my eyes. The nodes pulse against my temples. The hum begins. And somewhere, in a basement I may or may not have ever visited, in a moment that may or may not have occurred, I remember what I've done, what we've all done, what none of us can ever undo. The door opens. I don't remember unlocking it. Story 9. The smell hit me first. Not the expected mustiness of decay, but something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The iron gate of the Emmeline Theater groaned as we forced it open, the sound swallowed immediately by the fog that had rolled in from the river. 40 years since the fire, and the building still stood, a blackened tooth against the November sky. I'd been exploring abandoned places for 3 years, documenting the slow entropy of forgotten spaces. But this was different. The others felt it too. Graves moved ahead with his crowbar. His usual swagger diminished, while Octavia hung back, her camera already out, already recording. She was always recording. The lobby was intact, surprisingly so. Velvet curtains hung in tatters, their deep crimson faded to the color of dried blood. The ticket booth stood empty, its glass window reflecting our faces back at us. Distorted, elongated. I paused, studying my reflection. Something about it seemed wrong, the proportions slightly off. But when I blinked, it looked normal again. We'd researched the fire, of course. December 1984, during a midnight showing of something experimental, something the surviving records never quite named. 7 people died, they said, though the bodies were never properly identified. The official story blamed faulty wiring, but the unofficial whispers spoke of something else entirely. Screaming that didn't sound human. Audience members who walked into the flames willingly. A performance that continued even as the building burned. The main corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long. Our flashlights carved weak tunnels through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper printed with theatrical masks. Comedy and tragedy. Comedy and tragedy. Repeating endlessly. Except some of the masks were wrong, I realized. Their expressions were neither, showing something else entirely, something that made my stomach clench. Octavia whispered behind me that she was getting good footage, that this place was perfect. Her voice sounded far away, though she stood just at my shoulder. I wanted to tell her we should leave, that something felt fundamentally wrong about this place, but the words caught in my throat like cobwebs. We found the main theater through a set of double doors that opened too smoothly, their hinges silent despite decades of disuse. The space beyond was vast, rows of seats descending toward a stage that seemed to pulse in the beam of my flashlight, though that had to be a trick of the shadows. The ceiling disappeared into darkness overhead, and I had the sudden vertiginous sensation that we were looking not up but down into an abyss. Graves moved down the aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor, each step echoing back at us slightly out of sync. He was saying something about the building's structural integrity, his voice clinical, professional, but I wasn't listening. My attention had fixed on the stage itself, on the way the darkness there seemed thicker, more substantial, as if it were a presence rather than an absence. That's when we found the projection room. The stairway was hidden behind a panel that swung open when Octavia leaned against the wall, as though it had been waiting. The room above was small, cramped, filled with equipment that should have been rusted and ruined, but instead looked pristine, maintained. Film canisters lined the shelves, each labeled with dates and cryptic titles. The Awakening, The Convergence, The Recognition. And in the center, a projector pointed down through its window at the stage below, already threaded with film. I told them we shouldn't, that we should leave these things untouched. But Octavia was already examining the reels, Graves already checking the power. Impossibly, incredibly, when he flipped the ancient switch, lights hummed to life. The building had power. After 40 years, the building had power. The first reel showed a stage much like the one below us, but alive, filled with figures in elaborate costumes. They moved in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, their gestures precise and repetitive. There was no sound, but I could somehow hear them anyway, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper, a vibration that resonated in my chest. The performance was hypnotic, disturbing, beautiful in the way that watching a predator is beautiful, something deadly made elegant. As the figures moved, I began to notice details that made my skin prickle. The costumes weren't quite right, the proportions strange. What I'd taken for masks were faces, but faces that didn't move correctly, that suggested bones arranged in impossible configurations beneath the skin. And the performance itself, though I couldn't follow its narrative, felt like it was building towards something, some terrible revelation or transformation. Graves pointed out that some of the performers looked familiar, and he was right. That woman in the center, with her too wide smile. I'd seen her face before, on a missing person poster from the late 80s. And the man to her left, his movements jerky and unnatural, was the spitting image of a local teacher who'd vanished in the 90s. We told ourselves it was coincidence, similarity, our minds making patterns from chaos, but we didn't believe it. The second reel was worse. The performance had intensified, the movements more frantic, more purposeful. The camera work was strange, focusing on details that shouldn't have been significant. A particular seat in the audience, the way the shadows pooled in the corner of the stage, the almost imperceptible opening and closing of the curtains as though the theater itself were breathing. And through it all, that same vibration, that same sense of something building, accumulating, preparing to burst forth. When I recognized the next face, I felt my reality tilt. It was Juliana, a girl from my high school who disappeared during our senior year 15 years ago. She stood center stage, her mouth open in a silent scream or song, her hands raised in supplication or summoning. The camera held on her for a long moment, and I could swear her eyes found the lens, found us, watching across decades and death. We should have stopped then. We should have run, but the third reel was already loading itself, the projector clicking and whirring with mechanical certainty, and we were transfixed, unable to look away. This footage was different, newer, the quality sharper. though that made no sense. It showed the same stage, but empty now, the curtains drawn back to reveal nothing but darkness beyond. The camera remained fixed on that empty space for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and I found myself leaning forward, waiting for something to appear, to explain why this reel existed. Then the camera began to move. It panned slowly, deliberately toward the audience. The seats were no longer empty. Figures sat in them, shadowy and indistinct, but undeniably present. The camera moved from face to face, each one coming briefly into focus before sliding away to the next. And I began to recognize them too. Not as missing persons this time, but as people I'd seen more recently. A woman who'd sold me coffee that morning, a man I'd passed on the street last week, Octavia's neighbor, Graves's landlord. The recognition built like nausea, like certainty, like doom. The camera continued its methodical survey, moving closer to the front rows, to the center section. My hands were shaking, making my flashlight beam dance across the projection room walls. Octavia had stopped breathing, or so it seemed. Graves had backed away from the projector, his face pale in its reflected light. On screen, the camera focused on 3 seats in the center of the third row. The figures sitting there were clearer now, their features coming into sharp relief. I saw Graves first, unmistakably him, down to the scar above his left eyebrow, sitting rigid and staring at the empty stage with an expression of profound horror or ecstasy. I couldn't tell which. Beside him, Octavia, her camera raised, filming, always filming, her face slack and empty. And there, in the third seat, was me. I watched myself watching, my own face a study in terrible understanding, mouth slightly open as though I'd just realized something fundamental and awful about the nature of reality. The camera held on us for a long moment, and in that moment, I felt something shift, some barrier between then and now growing gossamer thin. The reel ended. The projector clicked off. In the sudden darkness, I heard breathing that wasn't ours, footsteps on the stairs that weren't ours. The rustle of movement in seats below that should have been empty. We ran, or tried to. The projection room door stuck, then gave way with a sound like a gasp. The corridor beyond stretched wrong, longer than before, the masks on the wallpaper all facing toward us now, all wearing that third expression, that one that was neither comedy nor tragedy but something else entirely. Behind us, from the theater proper, came sounds, the rustle of an audience settling into their seats, the murmur of anticipation, the heavy slide of curtains being drawn back. A spotlight snapped on somewhere, its beam visible through the gaps around the door, and I realized with dawning horror that the performance was beginning. We burst into the lobby, or what should have been the lobby. The space had changed, rearranged itself. The ticket booth was occupied now, a figure behind the glass watching us with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's. The main door stood ahead, but between us and them, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, converging. Graves reached the doors first and pulled, but they wouldn't open. They'd open inward, I knew they opened inward, but he was pulling and they weren't moving. Octavia was screaming, actually screaming, her camera forgotten, hanging from its strap and still recording, still documenting everything. That's when I saw the tickets. They were in my hand, though I had no memory of taking them. 3 tickets, pristine and white, printed with today's date, and a showtime that was, according to my watch, 7 minutes ago. The Emmeline Theater, they read, presents The Recognition. Center section, third row, seats 14, 15, and 16. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. The theater hadn't been waiting for new performers. It had been waiting for its audience to arrive. We'd seen ourselves in that footage not because we were going to be there, but because we already were. Because we'd always been there. Because from the moment we stepped through that gate, we'd stopped moving forward through time and started moving sideways, slipping into a space where the performance never ended and the audience never left. The doors gave way suddenly, and we spilled out into the night, gasping, clutching at each other, alive and free. The fog had lifted. The street was empty. My car sat where we'd left it, ordinary and solid and real. We drove away in silence, dropping Octavia at her apartment, Graves at his place. We promised to talk tomorrow, to make sense of what we'd seen, to watch the footage from Octavia's camera. But I knew we wouldn't. I knew that tomorrow we'd convince ourselves it was tricks of the dark, suggestible minds. The power of suggestion in a creepy place. We'd laugh nervously and agree never to go back. I'm sitting in my apartment now, writing this down while the memories are still fresh, while I can still feel the weight of those tickets in my hand. I've checked my pockets 3 times. They're not there. Of course they're not. Except, my coat, hanging by the door, seems heavier than it should. And somewhere, very faint, I can hear music. Not from any identifiable source, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. It sounds like an overture, like the beginning of something that's been waiting a very long time to start. Tomorrow, I know, I'll wake up and question all of this. I'll think maybe I'm tired, stressed, that we all fed off each other's fear and imagination. I'll watch the news and see people going about their normal lives. And I'll convince myself that the world is solid and sensible and safe. But tonight, right now, I keep thinking about that footage, about the figure sitting in seat 16, about the expression on my own face, that look of terrible understanding. And I keep thinking about what comes after recognition, what the next act might be. Because somewhere in this city, in a theater that should be empty, the curtain is rising, the seats are filled, the performance is beginning, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm supposed to be there, that some part of me already is, that the person sitting here writing this is just an echo, a projection, a recording of something that already happened. The music is getting louder now, or maybe I'm just learning to hear it better. The tickets are in my coat pocket after all. I just checked. I don't remember putting them there. The showtime is in 3 hours. I'm not going to go. I'm not. I'm going to stay here, lock my doors, wait for morning. I'm going to be rational and safe and sane. But my car keys are in my hand, and my coat is on my shoulders, and my feet are carrying me toward the door, as though they know something my conscious mind refuses to accept. The theater is waiting. The performance cannot begin without its audience. And I've had these tickets all along, haven't I? Since before I was born, since before the fire, since the first time the Emmeline Theater opened its doors and showed the world what lurks in the space between curtain and stage, between watcher and watched. I'm writing this last part in the car. The theater is ahead, its dark silhouette familiar now, almost comforting. The fog is returning, and in it I can see other cars arriving, other audience members making their way to the entrance. I recognize some of them from the footage. The coffee shop woman, the man from the street, all of us converging, all of us coming home. Octavia just texted. She's here. Graves, too. We're all here, finally, where we've always been supposed to be. The doors are opening. The usher is waiting. My seat is ready. The performance is about to begin. Story 10. The apartment smells wrong tonight. Not the usual staleness of recycled air and takeout containers, but something else beneath it. Copper and wet earth. I press my fingers against the port behind my right ear, feeling the familiar ridge of scar tissue where they installed the memory vault 3 years ago. The skin feels hot, inflamed, though it hasn't bothered me in months. I need another hit. Just one more replay. The technician at the clinic told me I was approaching dangerous usage levels, but what did he know about need? About the gnawing emptiness that follows you through every waking moment until you can slip back into something better, something already lived and cataloged and perfect. My fingers find the slim remote on the coffee table, navigate by muscle memory to file 247, that autumn afternoon when everything felt golden and possible. I close my eyes and press play. The memory loads differently this time. There's a lag, a stuttering quality like a corrupted video file. The familiar park bench materializes around me, the one overlooking the reservoir where I used to sit for hours. But the colors are too saturated, bleeding at the edges. The sky churns with clouds that move in reverse, and the water below reflects nothing, just a perfect black mirror. Then the details start changing. The jogger who usually passes at this point in the memory has a different face. Not slightly different, completely wrong. Where there should be a woman in her 30s with headphones and a purple jacket, there's someone else. Someone whose features shift and slide like melting wax whenever I try to focus directly on them. The purple jacket remains, incongruous, too bright against the wrongness underneath. My heart rate spikes. The memory vault interprets this as engagement, enthusiasm, and pushes deeper into the neural pathways. I can't pull out. The park bench feels too real now, the wood grain pressing into my palms with impossible clarity. Every splinter becomes a canyon of sensation. The figure approaches, gets closer than the jogger ever did in the original memory, close enough that I can smell something acrid and chemical, like burning plastic mixed with spoiled meat. A voice speaks, but it's not coming from the figure. It's coming from inside my own head, layered and echoing. You shouldn't be here. These aren't yours. I manage to tear myself out, gasping, my apartment reassembling around me in fragments. The couch materializes first, then the walls, then the steady drip of the kitchen faucet I keep meaning to fix. My hands are shaking. The remote has fallen to the floor. For the first time since I got the implant, I feel afraid of it. Sleep doesn't come. Instead, I lie in the dark and listen to the building settle around me. Every creak and groan amplified by exhaustion and adrenaline. The port behind my ear pulses with a heat that radiates down my neck. When I finally drift off around 4 in the morning, my dreams are full of faces that won't stay still, rooms that shift their dimensions when I'm not looking directly at them. The next day, I take the subway downtown to the clinic. The car is packed with the usual morning crush, bodies pressed together in artificial intimacy. I keep my eyes down, watching my reflection fragment across the scratched windows. But somewhere around the third stop, I start to feel it. The sensation of being watched, specific and intense, like a physical weight on the back of my neck. I turn slowly, scanning the crowd. Everyone is absorbed in their phones or their own thoughts, the practiced vacancy of city commuters. No one is looking at me, but the feeling intensifies, becomes almost unbearable. My skin crawls with it. A woman near the door catches my eye. She's wearing sunglasses despite the overcast morning, and something about her posture seems wrong, too rigid, like someone maintaining a pose for a photograph. When the doors open at the next stop, she doesn't move, even though she's positioned right in front of the exit. Just stands there while the crowd flows around her. The doors close. She's still watching me. I can feel it through the dark lenses. I force myself to look away, to focus on the advertisements running across the digital displays. But my peripheral vision keeps snagging on her, that unnaturally still figure in a sea of motion. When I risk another glance, she's gone. Completely vanished in the 30 seconds I wasn't looking. The space where she stood is empty, and no one else seems to have noticed. The clinic waiting room is trying too hard to be calming. Soft blue walls, white noise machines humming beneath new age music, the receptionist speaking in practiced gentle tones. I give my name and try not to fidget while I wait. The other patients look hollowed out, vacant in a way that has nothing to do with boredom. One man sits perfectly motionless, staring at nothing, a thin line of drool connecting his lip to his collar. That's what you'll look like soon, something whispers in my head, if you don't stop. When they finally call me back, it's not my usual technician. This one is younger, nervous, with eyes that won't quite meet mine. His name tag reads Elliot, and his hands shake slightly as he connects the diagnostic cables to my port. The scan takes longer than it should. I watch his face while the machine hums and clicks, watching his expression cycle through concentration, confusion, then something that might be fear. He pulls up screens of data I can't interpret, scrolls through long chains of code, his breathing getting shorter and faster. When he finally speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. Your memory files have been corrupted, but not by system failure. Someone's been accessing your implant remotely, uploading new data. The room tilts slightly. I grip the armrests of the examination chair. The questions pile up in my throat, but what comes out is just, how long? He swallows hard, Adam's apple bobbing. At least 6 months, maybe longer. The signatures are sophisticated, military-grade encryption. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. His fingers fly over the keyboard, pulling up file after file. These memories you've been replaying, the ones that feel wrong, they're not yours. They're not anyone's, not originally. They're composites, fragments stitched together from multiple sources. My mouth has gone dry. Multiple sources. He doesn't answer directly, just pulls up a visualization that makes my stomach drop. My memory files, the ones I've been using to escape reality for 3 years, are lit up with red markers. Corrupted data points, foreign neural patterns, and threaded through all of it, one recurring signature, one consistent contributor. The main source, he says, his voice dropping even lower. The memories that have been spliced into yours most frequently, they're flagged in the black market database. They were harvested from subjects who were... He trails off, unable or unwilling to finish. Were what? He closes the screen quickly, like he's seen something he shouldn't have. When he looks at me, there's genuine pity in his eyes. You need to remove the implant. Today, right now. And you need to be very careful. Whoever's been feeding you these files, they'll know the moment you start digging. They'll know I'm telling you this. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzes. A text from an unknown number. Don't trust him. Come to the address below. Alone. I can explain everything. The phone buzzes again before I can react. Another message from the same number. I've been watching you. I know what you're experiencing. The distortions, the feeling of being followed. It's real. All of it. And it's only going to get worse. A third message arrives while I'm still staring at the second. Unless you give me what I need. I don't go home. Can't risk it. Instead, I find myself walking, putting distance between myself and the clinic, my phone burning like a hot coal in my pocket. The city moves around me in familiar patterns, but nothing feels solid anymore. Every face in the crowd could be watching. Every window could hide an observer. The paranoia isn't helped by the fact that my implant keeps activating on its own, brief flashes of memory bleeding through my vision without my input. A street corner becomes suddenly overlaid with a different street corner, somewhere I've never been, somewhere that smells like gasoline and night air. A passing stranger's face ripples and reforms into someone else's features for just a moment. The boundary between now and then, between real and recalled, is dissolving. I duck into a coffee shop, order something I don't want just to have a reason to sit down. The barista looks at me with concern, and I wonder what expression I'm wearing. What's showing on my face that makes her hand tremble slightly when she gives me my change. My phone buzzes again. This time it's not a text, but a file transfer notification. Someone is sending me a memory directly, pushing it through the memory vault's wireless protocol. I should refuse it, delete it immediately. Instead, my finger hovers over the accept button, curiosity and dread mixing into something toxic. I accept. The memory hits hard and immediate, no gentle loading sequence. I'm somewhere industrial, all concrete and exposed pipes and fluorescent lights that flicker with a frequency just below the threshold of visible. The perspective is wrong, too low, and I realize with sick certainty that this isn't my memory. I'm experiencing someone else's point of view, someone who was terrified, who was trying to crawl away from something. The memory pans up, and I see a figure standing in the shadows. Tall, perfectly still, watching with an intensity that transcends the limitations of the recording. And even through the corrupted data and neural static, I recognize something about the stance. The way the head tilts slightly to one side. It's the same way the woman on the subway was standing. The memory ends abruptly, and I'm back in the coffee shop, gasping like I've been held underwater. Several other customers are staring. The barista has her phone out, probably ready to call someone. I force myself to stand, to walk calmly toward the exit, even though every instinct is screaming at me to run. Outside, the afternoon has turned gray and heavy. Rain threatens but hasn't started yet. I walk without direction, just moving. And that's when I notice the pattern. Certain people on the street, positioned at regular intervals, all facing the same direction, all watching the same spot, all watching me. They're not obvious about it. A man adjusting his tie, a woman checking her phone, a delivery driver leaning against his truck. But when I map their positions in my head, they form a perfect perimeter, a circle of observation with me at the center. My implant activates again, another unsolicited memory flooding my senses. This time it's a room I recognize, my own apartment, but filmed from an angle I've never seen. From somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at my couch, my coffee table, my life arranged like a museum display. Someone has been inside. Someone has been recording. The memory continues, and I watch myself from this impossible perspective. I'm asleep on the couch, the remote still clutched in my hand from another session. I look vulnerable, pathetic, completely unaware that I'm being observed. And then, in the memory, a hand enters the frame. Long fingers, surgical gloves, reaching toward my sleeping form, toward the port behind my ear. I tear myself out of the memory so violently that I stumble, nearly falling into the street. A car horn blares, someone shouts. But all I can think about is how many times I've woken up on that couch with no memory of falling asleep there, with unexplained gaps in time, with the port feeling tender and used. My phone rings, not a text this time, an actual call from the same unknown number. I stare at it for 3 rings, 4, 5. On the 6th, I answer. Silence on the other end, but not empty silence. The kind that's full of breathing, of presence, of someone listening as intently as I am. Finally, a voice. Gender ambiguous, modulated through some kind of filter that makes it sound both far away and intimately close. You've been living in dead time, moments that don't belong to you, experiences harvested from people who can't use them anymore. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you've become? Who are you? My voice sounds foreign, too high, too desperate. I'm a collector of memories, of experiences, of the final moments when everything becomes clear. I've curated thousands of hours, tens of thousands. The best moments, the most intense, the ones that burn brightest right before everything goes dark. The voice pauses and I can hear something in the background, a rhythmic sound that might be footsteps. But you have something of mine, something precious, and I want it back. I don't have anything. File 247, the park bench, the autumn afternoon. That's not your memory. It's one of my favorites, actually. Took me years to acquire the source material, to edit it just right. And somehow, through some glitch or error or act of incredible bad luck, it ended up in your implant, mixed in with all the other recycled data I've been feeding you. The footsteps in the background are getting louder, closer. I spin around, scanning the street, trying to identify which of the watchers is on the phone, but they've all disappeared. The perimeter has collapsed, or I'm imagining it, or they were never there at all. I'm going to get it back, the voice continues, calm, patient, the tone of someone discussing the weather. I'm going to extract every memory I've gifted you, and in return, I'm going to give you something new, something no one else has experienced. The memory of right now, of this conversation, of the exact moment when you realize there's nowhere left to run. Won't that be nice? A complete set. Before and after. The full experience. The line goes dead. I'm running before I consciously decide to move. Feet pounding pavement, breath coming in ragged gasps. The city blurs around me, familiar landmarks becoming strange, the late afternoon light taking on a sickly quality that makes everything look jaundiced and diseased. My implant fires randomly, overlaying past moments on present ones, until I can't tell if I'm running down this street or that one, if it's now or 3 months ago or some impossible collision of both. A hand grabs my arm, spins me around. It's Elliot from the clinic, but his face is wrong, the features subtly rearranged, like someone doing a bad impression of him. He's saying something urgent, but the words are delayed, arriving half a second after his lips move. I wrench away, keep running, and the city becomes a maze of overlapping realities. The park bench from file 247 appears in the middle of an intersection. The industrial space from the scent memory materializes around me for just a moment. Concrete and fluorescent lights superimposed over storefronts and street signs. I end up in an alley, pressed against cold brick, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The port behind my ear is burning now, hot enough that I'm sure it must be leaving marks, cooking the surrounding skin. I reach back to touch it and my fingers come away wet. Not blood. Something else. Clear fluid that catches the light oddly, like oil or tears, or something that exists in the space between physical and digital. My phone buzzes one final time. Not a call or text, but a calendar notification. An appointment I don't remember scheduling. Memory extraction. Tonight. Location TBD. And that's when I see them. At the mouth of the alley, backlit by the setting sun, 3 figures standing perfectly still. The one in the middle is wearing purple, that same impossible purple jacket from the corrupted memory. As I watch, they begin to walk toward me in perfect synchronization, each step measured and identical. I have nowhere left to go. The alley dead ends behind me, brick wall solid and real and offering no escape. My implant activates again, showing me this moment from their perspective, from all 3 perspectives simultaneously. I see myself through their eyes, small and trapped and afraid, and I understand with sudden terrible clarity that this is what I've been watching all along. Every corrupted memory, every distorted file, every moment that felt wrong. They were all rehearsals, preparations, different angles of the same inevitable scene. The figures are close now, close enough that I can see their faces cycling through different features, trying on various expressions like masks. Close enough that I can smell that chemical scent, plastic and meat and earth. Close enough to reach out and touch the port behind my ear with their gloved hands. One of them speaks, the voice unfiltered now, raw and hungry. Thank you for keeping these safe. We're going to take such good care of them, and you'll get to see everything, from every angle, forever. The port connects with a click that echoes inside my skull. The extraction begins. My memories start to flow outward, draining like water from a broken vessel, and in their place comes something else. The full archive. Every moment they've collected, every final experience, every perspective from every harvested consciousness, flooding into me in a torrent I cannot stop. I feel myself fragmenting, splitting into countless viewpoints, countless moments of terror and confusion, and the desperate animal need to escape that never finds resolution. The alley becomes 1,000 different places. The figures become 1,000 different collectors. I become 1,000 different versions of prey, all experiencing the same ending in infinite variation. And through it all, one thought remains coherent, holding on with desperate strength as everything else dissolves. I don't know if I'm experiencing this now, or if this is just another memory, another file, another moment someone decided to save and share and sell to whoever wanted to feel the special intimacy of watching someone break. I don't know if I'm still in my apartment, remote in hand, lost in another playback session, imagining threats and chases and purple-jacketed figures because my brain is finally eating itself from the inside out. I don't know if Elliot was real, or if the clinic exists, or if I'm writing this or remembering writing this or reading a memory of someone else writing this while thinking they were me. The extraction continues, or starts, or has been happening forever. The figures remain, or vanish, or were never there at all. The alley stays solid around me, or dissolves into the 1,000 other places I've been or will be, or never was. And in my pocket, my phone buzzes with a notification I'll never read, a message I'll never answer, another file transfer from another unknown source, ready to show me one more moment that doesn't belong to me, one more experience that will layer itself over whatever remains of who I used to be, until the distinction becomes meaningless, until everything is just data waiting to be played back and consumed and recycled again. The port behind my ear burns with a heat that transcends sensation, and I realize with the last coherent thought I may ever have that I don't know if I'm screaming, or if I'm just remembering screaming, or if I'm experiencing someone else's memory of this moment, recorded and curated and fed back to me in an endless loop. I don't know. I don't know. I don't. The humming started 3 weeks before the first wave. I remember because I was in the observatory when Dr. Chen first isolated it, a low-frequency pulse buried beneath layers of cosmic static. At first we thought it was equipment malfunction, some feedback loop in our aging receivers. But the pattern was too clean, too deliberate. Mathematics doesn't lie, and what we were hearing was unmistakably mathematical, a sequence. Prime numbers ascending, then descending, then something else entirely. Something that looked like a countdown. The research facility sat perched on the edge of Lake Superior, close enough that on quiet nights you could hear the water lapping against the rocks below. I'd worked there for 6 years, cataloging radio signals from deep space, searching for patterns in the noise. This was the first time the noise had searched back. Chen spent 72 hours without sleep trying to decode the full sequence. I brought him coffee that he didn't drink and food that congealed on paper plates while he scribbled equations across 3 whiteboards. His hands shook when he finally showed me what he'd found. Not from exhaustion, I realized later. From fear. The countdown would reach 0 in 11 days. We reported it, of course. Filed the proper documentation with the appropriate agencies. The response was predictable. Bureaucratic acknowledgement followed by silence. They probably thought we were crying wolf, another SETI team desperate for validation. I might have thought the same thing if I hadn't been there in the room when Chen played the full decoded sequence through the speakers. It sounded like singing. Deep, resonant, almost below the threshold of hearing. It made my teeth ache and my eyes water. Chen shut it off after 30 seconds, but the sound lingered in my skull for hours afterward, a phantom vibration that wouldn't quiet. That night I dreamed of water for the first time. Dark water, stretching endlessly in all directions, and something massive moving beneath the surface. I woke with my sheets damp with sweat, my mouth tasting of salt and copper. The lake outside my window was perfectly still, reflecting the moonlight like polished obsidian. I told myself it was nothing, just the stress manifesting in my subconscious. I was good at lying to myself back then. The humming grew louder over the following days, not in our equipment, but in the air itself, a subtle vibration that you felt more than heard. Other people started noticing it too. The graduate students working late shifts complained of headaches and nausea. 2 of them quit without explanation, packed their things and drove away in the middle of the night. Chen stopped eating entirely. He'd stand at the window for hours, staring out at the lake, his lips moving silently as though reciting something. I asked him once what he was thinking about. He didn't turn around when he answered, his voice flat and distant. The water is deep here. Very deep. 5 days before 0, the first reports started coming in from around the world. Unusual behavioral patterns detected in coastal populations. People standing on beaches, staring at the horizon. Swimmers venturing further out than usual, requiring rescue. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or confirmation bias. But the pattern was there if you knew how to look. I knew how to look. The facility director called an emergency meeting and told us we were shutting down for a week. Mandatory leave. Some nonsense about equipment maintenance and safety inspections. We all knew what it really meant. They wanted us gone before whatever was going to happen, happened. Most of the staff left that same day. Chen didn't. Neither did I. We had to know. 3 days before 0, I stopped being able to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that dream ocean, feeling something vast and ancient moving beneath me. The pressure of its attention was suffocating, like being observed by something so large that it didn't quite understand what I was. An ant beneath a magnifying glass, a specimen on a slide. Chen had stopped speaking almost entirely by then. He'd set up a cot in the observation room and stayed there around the clock, monitoring the signal. His eyes had taken on a strange, glassy quality, and there were dark circles beneath them that looked less like exhaustion and more like bruises. Sometimes I'd catch him with his ear pressed against the wall, listening to something I couldn't hear. The night before 0, I found him standing at the edge of the facility's boat dock, his feet inches from the water. The lake was perfectly calm, but the moonlight on its surface seemed wrong somehow, too bright, almost phosphorescent. I called his name and he turned to look at me. For just a moment I didn't recognize him. His expression was serene, almost blissful, and when he smiled, his teeth looked too white in the darkness. He told me he could hear them singing down there, building their cathedral in the deep places. He said it was beautiful. He said I'd understand soon. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back from the edge, and the moment my skin touched his, I heard it too, that deep, resonant sound from the decoded signal, but this time it wasn't coming from speakers or equipment. It was coming from everywhere, from the water and the air and the ground beneath our feet. It was coming from inside my own chest, resonating in my bones. I let go and stumbled backward, my heart hammering. Chen just stood there, still smiling that terrible, peaceful smile. Then he walked back to the facility without another word, leaving me alone on the dock with the sound of gentle waves and something else. Something that might have been breathing, rising from the depths below. 0 hour came at 3:47 a.m. I was in the observation room, had been for hours, unable to do anything else. The countdown reached its final sequence and the signal changed. It went from that low-frequency hum to something else entirely. Something that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain. Not sound exactly, but meaning, pure and undiluted. The invitation. Through the window I watched them come. People emerging from houses, from cars, from everywhere. Moving with synchronized purpose, converging on the lake. There was no running, no panic. Just that steady, inexorable march toward the water. They walked into the shallows, into the depths, and kept walking even as the water rose over their heads. They didn't struggle. They didn't drown. They simply continued, step by step, down into darkness. Chen went too, of course. I watched him walk past the window, his expression still serene, still smiling. He didn't look back. I didn't go. Something in me resisted. Some stubborn, screaming part of my consciousness that refused the invitation. The signal battered against my mind like waves against a breakwater, but I held firm. I don't know why I was immune, or if immune is even the right word. Maybe I was just broken in the right way. Maybe my fear was stronger than the call. The lake took thousands that night. The morning news was chaos, global panic, conspiracy theories and religious fervor and government denials. But I wasn't watching the news. I was watching the lake. The water had changed. It was darker now, thicker somehow, and there were patterns on the surface, geometric formations that shouldn't exist in nature. And beneath them, lights. Faint at first, then growing stronger. Bioluminescence, perhaps, or something else. Something they were building down there in the crushing pressure and absolute dark. I stayed at the facility because I had nowhere else to go. The world was fracturing, people arguing about whether it was mass hysteria or religious rapture or aliens or biological warfare. Nobody wanted to hear about radio signals from deep space or mathematical sequences that predicted human behavior. That was too strange, too inexplicable. But I knew. And in the following days I began to understand more. The ones who'd gone into the water, they weren't dead. I could feel them sometimes, at the edge of my perception, a presence vast and distributed, like a colony organism or a neural network. Thousands of minds, maybe millions by now, all connected, all working towards something, building something. Chen was down there. I knew this with absolute certainty. Part of him was still Chen, but part of him was also something larger, something that had existed long before humans looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. Something that had been waiting in the dark waters of the universe, patient and eternal, for exactly the right frequency to carry its signal home. I started having the dreams again, more vivid now, more detailed. I could see what they were building. Impossible architecture, non-Euclidean geometry that hurt to look at, structures that existed in more dimensions than my mind could process. A cathedral, Chen had called it. But it was more than that. It was a gateway, a door opening onto something vast and terrible and beautiful all at once. 3 weeks after the first wave, the signal began again. The same pattern, the same sequence, but this time it was stronger. So much stronger. I could feel it in my fillings, in the metal frame of my bed, in the wiring behind the walls. The whole facility thrummed with it like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. And this time I knew I wouldn't be able to resist. Already I could feel my immunity crumbling, that stubborn core of resistance wearing thin under the relentless pressure of the signal. I found myself standing at windows, staring at the lake, watching those lights pulse beneath the surface in rhythm with something I could almost hear, almost understand. The countdown was shorter this time, 7 days instead of 11. They were accelerating, becoming more efficient, learning, or perhaps they'd always known, and the first wave had just been a test, a calibration of the signal to match human neurology. I tried to leave, got in my car, started driving inland, away from the lake, away from the ocean, toward the high deserts where water was scarce and the earth was dry. But every gas station I stopped at had a fountain. Every town had a reservoir. Water was everywhere, and with it, that insistent pull, that growing certainty that I was supposed to be somewhere else, somewhere deeper. On the 4th day of the second countdown, I turned the car around. I told myself it was to document what happened, to be a witness, to gather data that someone might find useful. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. I was curious. I wanted to see what they were building. I wanted to understand what had taken Chen and all the others. I wanted to know why the universe had sung to us from the darkness between stars, and what it wanted us to become. The facility was empty when I returned. Everyone else had been taken in the first wave or fled afterward. It was just me and the signal and the lake, dark and patient, waiting below. I'm writing this now, in the observation room, with the countdown at 18 hours and falling. The signal is so loud I can barely think. My hands shake as I type, and I have to keep stopping to wipe the tears from my eyes, though I don't know why I'm crying. Fear, maybe, or anticipation, or both. The lights beneath the lake are much brighter now, close to the surface, as though whatever they're building is nearly complete. Sometimes I think I can see shapes moving down there, human-shaped but wrong, adapted to the pressure and the darkness. Sometimes I think I can hear Chen's voice among the chorus, calling my name. Soon I'll walk down to the dock. Soon I'll step off the edge and feel the cold water close over my head. Soon I'll take that final step into the deep, and I'll join them, and I'll understand everything. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just die like anyone who walks into a lake and doesn't come back up. Maybe this is all delusion, some mass psychosis triggered by infrasound or environmental toxins, or the simple, terrible loneliness of being human in an indifferent universe. I don't know anymore what's real. I don't know if the signal came from space or from somewhere deeper, from the dark places in our own minds that we've always been afraid to explore. I don't know if Chen and the others are transformed or simply gone, if they're building a cathedral or slowly decomposing on the lake floor, while I invent meaning to cope with their absence. All I know is that the countdown reaches 0 in 17 hours, and when it does, I'll be standing at the water's edge, waiting to see which truth drowns me. The signal is so beautiful now, like singing, like coming home. I wonder what we'll build together, down where the light doesn't reach. Story 12. The first time I counted the doors on my floor, I reached 14. The second time, 17. By the third count, I'd stopped trusting my own arithmetic. I'd moved into the Ashford building 3 months ago, drawn by the reasonable rent and the proximity to my office downtown. The building manager, a gaunt man named Eli Thorne who wore the same gray cardigan regardless of the season, had mentioned nothing unusual during the tour. Just pointed out the amenities, elevator at the end of each corridor, garbage chute on every floor, laundry in the basement. Standard features for a 1970s apartment complex that had seen better decades. But there were the doors. My apartment was 7F, 7th floor, Unit F. Simple enough. except the hallway that led to my door contained entrances that made no geometric sense. Between 7E and 7F, there should have been nothing but wall. Instead, 3 doors stood in that space, unmarked and identical to every other door in the building. Same brushed steel numbers that should have been there. Same peeling beige paint. Same tarnished brass handles. I'd asked Thorne about them during my second week. He'd looked at me with eyes that seemed too tired for his age, and told me that some doors were maintenance access, others led to storage spaces created during renovations, and a few were simply architectural quirks from when the building expanded in the 80s. He'd suggested, with a politeness that felt rehearsed, that I shouldn't worry about doors that weren't mine. The problem was, I couldn't stop noticing them. They multiplied in my peripheral vision. Walking to the elevator, I'd count 6 doors between mine and 7G. Returning an hour later, there'd be 8. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my molars ache, and in that sickly yellow glow, the hallway seemed to stretch and contract like something breathing. I began creating a map. Not out of obsession, I told myself, but practicality. If the building's layout was genuinely confusing, documentation would help. I used my phone at first, photographing each door, noting its position relative to the apartments I knew were legitimate. The photos came out strange, blurred in ways that my phone's camera shouldn't produce. In some shots, doors appeared in positions where I'd sworn there'd been only wall seconds before. The other residents moved through the hallways like sleepwalkers, eyes forward, never pausing at the extra doors. In the elevator, they stared at the numbers above the door with an intensity that suggested determination rather than absent-mindedness. Mrs. Delacroix from 7C, a woman in her 70s who'd lived here for decades, had perfected this practiced ignorance. When I'd tried to mention the doors to her once, she'd simply smiled with her entire face except her eyes, and told me that old buildings have their peculiarities. That was before the disappearances started, or perhaps they'd been happening all along, and I'd only just begun noticing. It began with sounds. Late at night, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, normal enough in an apartment building. But these footsteps would approach a door, stop, and then come the sound of it opening. Not the familiar click and squeak of an apartment door, but something heavier, like a bank vault seal breaking. And then, silence. No footsteps continuing into an apartment, no door closing. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the building's ancient pipes groaning through the walls. I started keeping a log. Each time I heard those sounds, I'd note the time and try to determine which door had opened. The pattern emerged gradually, like a photograph developing. The sounds always came from the unmarked doors, the extras, the ones that shouldn't exist. Then Ravi from 7H vanished. The building manager claimed he'd broken his lease and moved out suddenly. But I'd seen Ravi's car in the parking garage the morning after his supposed departure. His mail accumulated in the lobby box. When I walked past 7H, I could smell the beginning rot of forgotten food through the crack under his door. No one else seemed concerned. The other residents continued their determined ignorance, and Thorne had simply shrugged when I'd pressed him about it, mentioning something about the deposit being forfeit and the lease terms being clear. That's when I decided to investigate properly. I started with the building's history. The library's digital archives contained more than I'd expected. The Ashford building stood on the former site of the Whitmore Sanitarium, a private psychiatric facility that operated from 1923 to 1959. The sanitarium had gained a reputation for experimental treatments. The articles used that word, experimental, with a careful neutrality that suggested something darker lurking beneath. What I found in the medical journals from that era made my skin prickle in the overheated library reading room. Dr. Virgil Whitmore, the sanitarium's founder, had been obsessed with perception and spatial awareness. His published papers discussed treating patients with distorted senses of space and time, but his proposed methods were unconventional. He'd theorized that certain geometries could affect human consciousness, that architecture itself could be therapeutic or harmful. The sanitarium had burned in 1959, a fire that killed 3 staff members and injured several patients. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but I found a letter to the editor in a local paper from the week before the fire, written by a former nurse at the facility. She'd claimed that Dr. Whitmore's experiments had gone too far, that he was no longer trying to cure perceptual disorders but creating them, that he'd built rooms and corridors that made people lose their sense of when and where they were. The letter ended abruptly, as if the editor had cut it off mid-thought. When the Ashford building was constructed in 1970, the architectural plans showed a standard residential layout. But comparing those plans to the building as it existed now revealed discrepancies. Corridors that should have been straight showed odd angles. Spaces that should have contained apartments gaped empty on the blueprints, and throughout the plans, in faded pencil marks that looked like a later addition, someone had drawn small symbols, circles with radiating lines, next to certain walls. I took those blueprints home and spread them across my apartment floor, trying to overlay them with my own maps. The symbols corresponded almost exactly with where I'd documented the extra doors. That night I heard my neighbor screaming. Not from 7E or 7G, the apartments that actually bordered mine. The scream came from somewhere that shouldn't exist, somewhere in the wall between us. It lasted only seconds before cutting off sharply, but in that brief moment, I'd recognized the voice, Mrs. Delacroix. I ran into the hallway. The fluorescent lights were flickering, casting the corridor in strobe-like pulses of darkness and sickly light. 3 doors down from mine, one of the unmarked doors stood open. Not wide, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. The air that drifted from that opening felt wrong. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Cold like the absence of something vital. And beneath that coldness, a smell. Not decay exactly, but something close, like old paper and copper and a sweetness that made my throat close. I should have closed it. Should have gone back to my apartment, locked the door, called building management. Instead, I approached. The darkness beyond the door wasn't complete. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a corridor identical to the one I stood in. Same beige paint, same industrial carpet worn through to the backing in places. But the fluorescent lights in that other corridor weren't flickering. They weren't on at all. The faint illumination came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in. I heard breathing. Not my own, though my breath came shallow and quick. This breathing was measured, deliberate. The sound of something waiting with infinite patience. Then I heard Mrs. Delacroix's voice, distant and echoing. She was speaking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a way that suggested barely controlled panic. She was saying that she'd made a mistake, that she'd opened the wrong door, that she just wanted to go home, please. She just wanted to go home. But there was no other voice responding, just that steady, patient breathing. I reached for the door to close it, and that's when I saw the writing on the frame, carved into the metal, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Dates. Dozens of them, scratched in tiny, desperate numerals. They went back decades. 1971, 1985, 1993, 2009. The most recent was from 2 weeks ago. My hand touched the door's edge, and pain lanced through my fingers. Not from any physical injury. The metal wasn't sharp or hot. But the sensation of touching it felt like touching something that existed in multiple moments simultaneously. My fingers were here, in the hallway, in October. But they were also somewhere else, someone else. I could feel other hands in the same space overlapping mine, some panicked and clawing, others limp and resigned. I yanked my hand back. The door swung shut on its own, the sound of its closing echoing down the hallway in both directions at once. Mrs. Delacroix's voice cut off mid-plea. I stood in the empty corridor, my hand throbbing with phantom sensations, and noticed something that made my stomach drop. My apartment door, 7F, was no longer where it had been. The entire hallway had shifted. The door that had been 3 down from mine was now directly across. The elevator that should have been to my left was gone entirely, replaced by a stretch of corridor that seemed to curve slightly, though the building had only straight hallways. I walked toward where my apartment should be, counting doors. 14, 20, 32. The numbers on the doors I passed made no sense. 7F, 7M, 7Q, 7AA. Some had no numbers at all, just empty spaces where the brass letters should have been fixed. The fluorescent lights continued their irregular flickering, and in the gaps of darkness between pulses, I saw movement, shadows that didn't correspond to anything casting them, shapes that moved against the direction of the light. And I heard more breathing now, not from one direction but all around me, in the walls, under the floor, above the drop ceiling with its water-stained tiles, patient and waiting and hungry. I found a door marked 7F finally, but when I tried my key, it wouldn't turn. The apartment beyond looked wrong through the peephole. Same layout, same furniture, but everything was positioned slightly off. The couch faced the wrong direction. The bookshelf stood where the TV should be. And sitting in my chair, back to the door, was a figure I couldn't quite focus on. Every time I tried to look directly at it, my eyes slid away, finding purchase on anything else. I ran. The hallway stretched before me, doors multiplying on either side. I passed residents I recognized. Mr. Kowalski from 7B, the young couple from 7J. But they stood motionless in their doorways, watching me with expressions that suggested they were trying to remember something important. Trying to remember me, perhaps. Or trying to remember what they themselves had once been. The elevator appeared suddenly, its doors opening with a cheerful ding that felt obscene in the oppressive silence. I lunged inside, jabbing the button for the lobby. The doors closed with agonizing slowness, and in that narrowing gap, I saw Thorne standing at the far end of the hallway. He raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a warning, his expression that same practiced neutrality he'd worn during my tour. The elevator descended. The numbers above the door counted down normally at first, 7, 6, 5, but then began skipping, 4, 2, 1, 5. The car jerked and shuddered. Through the crack at the bottom of the door, I could see the elevator shaft walls sliding past. But they weren't concrete and metal. They were covered in markings, the same circular symbols with radiating lines I'd seen on the blueprints, carved and painted and scratched into every surface. Some looked fresh. Others had weathered to near invisibility. The elevator stopped with a violent lurch that threw me against the back wall. The doors opened onto a corridor I didn't recognize. Not the lobby. Not any floor I'd been on before. The carpet here was pristine, the walls recently painted. Modern LED lights provided steady, shadowless illumination. A sign on the wall read, Whitmore Sanitarium, Ward 7. I could smell antiseptic and something burning. Somewhere in the distance, someone was conducting an experiment. I could hear Dr. Whitmore's voice. I knew it was his somehow, knew it with absolute certainty, explaining something to his colleagues about perception and geometry, and the thin places where time folded back on itself. The elevator doors began to close. I threw myself between them, felt them impact my shoulders, and tumbled out into the corridor. The doors sealed shut behind me, and the elevator descended further, or ascended, or moved in some direction my mind couldn't properly categorize. I ran down the pristine hallway, past rooms with windows that showed patients inside. They were all standing, all facing the doors, all with that same expression of trying to remember something crucial. In one room, I saw a face I recognized. Ravi, but decades younger, dressed in clothes from another era, staring out at me with empty eyes that held no recognition. The hallway ended at a heavy door marked, Private Dr. Whitmore. It stood ajar. Beyond it, I could hear that breathing again, patient and eternal. And beneath it, a voice. My voice. I was in there, beyond that door, and I was explaining to someone how the building worked, how the doors connected different moments, different instances of the same space, how something had learned to use those connections, moving through time like we move through rooms, hunting for those rare moments when someone opened the wrong door at the wrong time. I was explaining that I'd been trying to map it for decades, that every time I got close to understanding, I'd make a mistake, open the wrong door, and end up back at the beginning. Sometimes months earlier, sometimes years. The building always brought me back eventually, drawn like a fish on a line. I was explaining that I couldn't remember my name anymore, or when I'd moved in, or what I'd done before this became my entire existence. I was explaining that I thought maybe I'd been one of Dr. Whitmore's patients once, or maybe one of his colleagues. Or maybe I'd been born from the experiments themselves, a thing that only existed in the spaces between moments, in the cracks where time folded wrong. I was explaining that I couldn't stop trying to map it, couldn't stop opening doors, because the thing that hunted through these temporal corridors was getting better at its hunting, faster, more efficient, and if I didn't figure out how to close the doors permanently, it would eventually learn to open them from its side, to push through into the moments where people lived their normal lives, unaware of the predator moving through time toward them. I stood in the hallway outside Dr. Whitmore's office, listening to myself explain all of this in a voice flat with exhaustion and acceptance, and I understood that I'd had this revelation before, many times. That I was trapped in a loop of my own making, drawn to investigate the building's mysteries, discovering the truth, and then losing it all when I inevitably opened another wrong door. The breathing grew louder. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, but the corridor had changed. The pristine walls were now covered in blueprints, thousands of them, taped and tacked and nailed to every surface, all showing the same building, all with those circular symbols marking the same locations, and on every blueprint, in handwriting I didn't want to recognize but did, notes had been scrawled in the margins, notes about the doors, about what moved through them, about how many times I'd tried and failed to stop it. The elevator was gone. In its place, just another unmarked door. I could hear Mrs. Delacroix on the other side of it, still pleading to go home. I could hear Ravi, his voice younger but already resigned. I could hear dozens of others, all asking the same questions, all trapped in the same eternal moment of realizing their mistake. And I could hear myself among them, my voice joining that chorus, explaining again about the doors and the map and the thing that hunted through time. My apartment key was still in my hand. I looked at it, at the engraved 7F, and noticed for the first time that the edges were worn smooth. Not from weeks or months of use, but years, decades. How long had I been carrying this key? How long had I been trying to find my apartment? The breathing was behind me now. I turned slowly, because what choice did I have? The hallway stretched in both directions, infinite and identical. Every door was unmarked. Every door was wrong. And standing at the far end, barely visible in the flickering lights, was something that might have been Dr. Whitmore once, or might have been all of his patients folded into a single shape, or might have been the building itself, given form and hunger. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. Time itself was moving, flowing like a current, and I was caught in it, drifting slowly backward, or forward, or in some direction that had no name, toward the moment when I would open the wrong door again, toward the beginning of the loop, toward the instant I'd first noticed there were too many doors on my floor. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a reminder I'd set weeks ago, or years ago, or in some other iteration of this moment. The screen showed a single note. Count the doors, trust the map, don't open anything marked with circles. But I couldn't remember what the circles meant. I couldn't remember why I'd written this warning to myself. The knowledge was slipping away like water through fingers, leaving only the vague sense that I'd understood something important once. The hallway's fluorescent lights steadied, stopping their flicker. The building settled around me with the sound of old bones finding comfortable positions. From somewhere far above or far below or far in some other direction entirely, I heard the sound of a door closing and a lock clicking into place. I found myself standing in front of apartment 7F. My apartment. The door was exactly where it should be, and my key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it this morning. The blueprints were gone from my floor. My phone's photo gallery showed only normal pictures. No blurred images of impossible doors. My notes about the building's history had deleted themselves, leaving just the default apps on my home screen. I walked to my window and looked out at the city. Evening was falling, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple. Cars moved through the streets below in their normal patterns. People walked their dogs. Life continued in its usual rhythm. Behind me I heard a sound. Just the building settling, probably. The pipes groaning as someone elsewhere turned on their shower. the ordinary noises of an ordinary apartment building. But when I turned around, I counted the walls of my living room. 4 walls, standard for a rectangular room. I counted again, because something felt wrong. 4 walls. I counted a third time, slowly, touching each one to be certain. 5 walls. The extra wall was exactly where a wall should be. Same paint, same baseboards, same electrical outlet. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from memories I couldn't quite access, that yesterday there had been only 4. In the center of that 5th wall, at exactly eye level, someone had carved a small symbol, a circle with radiating lines. And below it, barely visible unless you knew to look, a question scratched in letters so small I had to press my face nearly against the wall to read them. How many times have you counted the doors today? I stood in my apartment as evening deepened tonight, trying to remember if I'd moved in 3 months ago, or 3 years, or 30. Trying to remember if my name was written on the lease or just appeared there, like the extra doors, waiting for someone to notice something was wrong. From the hallway outside my apartment, I heard footsteps approaching. They stopped at my door, paused, continued down the hallway to where they shouldn't be able to continue, because the hallway ended at the elevator. But I could hear them walking further, growing fainter, and then the sound of a door, a heavy door, like a vault, opening somewhere in the impossible distance. The breathing began again, patient and eternal, waiting for me to forget, waiting for me to notice the doors again, waiting for me to start mapping the building again, waiting for me to open something I shouldn't, because that's what I do. That's all I've ever done. That's all I'll ever do. I just can't remember why I started, or if I ever had a choice to stop. Story 13. The pills sit on my nightstand like small white sentinels, their presence as necessary as breath itself. 23 years of practice, 23 years of swallowing other people's terrors, and I've never missed a dose. Until tonight. The realization comes at 3:47 a.m. when I wake to find my tongue thick and cotton dry, my hands trembling with a frequency I don't recognize as my own. The pill case lies open and full beside my water glass. The ritual undone, the dam unguarded. I discovered the technique by accident during my residency, back when I still believed in the sterile boundaries between doctor and patient, between their minds and mine. Mrs. Chen, no, I shouldn't use names even in my own thoughts, an elderly woman with night terrors so severe she'd gone 72 hours without sleep. Standard treatments failed. In desperation, I tried an experimental hypnotic approach, pressing my consciousness against the membrane of her dream state, and I fell through. Her nightmare was a gray room that stretched infinitely, filled with the sound of her mother's disappointed sighs. I could taste the shame in the air, feel the weight of expectations pressing down like wet wool. When I reached out to touch the walls, they dissolved. The terror flowed into me like ice water through a crack, and when we both woke, she smiled for the first time in months. She slept peacefully that night. I did not. But I learned to manage it. The medication keeps them contained, pressed down into some deep cavity in my mind where they can't take form. The nightly ritual, the pills, the breathing exercises, the mantra I repeat in the dark, keeps the seal intact. 743 patients over the years, 743 nightmares living inside me like insects in amber, preserved and paralyzed. Now the walls are breathing. I press my palms against the bedroom drywall, needing to confirm it's solid, but the texture shifts under my fingers. Rough, then smooth, then wet. The shadows in the corners are too dark, possessing a density that light should penetrate but doesn't. Something moves within them, patient and watchful. The first one manifests near my closet door. It's a translucent thing, humanoid but wrong in its proportions, with limbs that bend at too many angles. I recognize it immediately, the embodiment of professional failure I absorbed from a surgeon 6 years ago. the fear of hands that destroy instead of heal. It doesn't approach, just stands there, its head cocked at an angle that suggests both curiosity and hunger. "You're not real," I say to the empty room, but my voice cracks on the last word. The thing's mouth, if it has one, might be smiling. I back toward the bedroom door, my hand finding the light switch. The overhead fixture flares to life, but it doesn't help. The shadows don't recede, they simply relocate, pooling in new corners, growing thicker. In the harsh light, I can see more of them now. A woman-shaped silhouette with eyes like empty wells, embodying the fear of abandonment I took from a man who'd lost everyone he loved. A creature of teeth and static, the manifestation of a teenager's social anxiety, twisted into something predatory. They're all here. Every nightmare I've consumed, every terror I've swallowed and suppressed, taking form in the space between sleep and waking. The surgeon's fear moves first, its two long fingers reaching toward me. I bolt from the room, slamming the door behind me. But even as I do, I know it's futile. They're not contained by doors or walls. They're mine now, have always been mine, living in the architecture of my mind. They're just finally strong enough to build their own doors from the inside out. The hallway stretches longer than it should, the walls pulsing with the rhythm of breath or heartbeat. I can't tell which. The carpet under my bare feet feels wet, though when I look down, it's dry. The sensation persists anyway, cold moisture seeping between my toes with each step. In the kitchen, I try to think rationally. Withdrawal symptoms from missing the medication, hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion. But rationality feels thin here, like tissue paper held up against a hurricane. I can hear them moving through my apartment, footsteps that don't quite sound like feet, whispers in languages I absorbed, but never learned. A middle-aged banker's dread of poverty manifests as a shadow that consumes light, leaving gaps in reality where it touches. An artist's fear of creative death takes the form of hands that reach from walls, their fingers stained with ink that might be blood. A teacher's terror of being forgotten becomes a figure that flickers in and out of existence, never solid enough to fully see. They don't attack. That's almost worse. They simply exist, filling my space with their presence, their patient observation. They're waiting for something. The bathroom mirror shows my reflection, but delayed by half a heartbeat, my movements echoed a fraction too slowly. I splash cold water on my face, but the droplets that run down my cheeks feel warm, almost feverish. When I look up again, my reflection's eyes are black, pupils dilated to consume the iris entirely. I grip the sink's edge, porcelain cold and solid under my palms, the most real thing I've felt in hours. The medical training I spent decades accumulating tries to assert itself. This is a psychotic break, it insists. Discontinuation syndrome. You need to call for help, get to a hospital, re-establish the medication regimen. But I know better. I've been inside too many minds, touched too many nightmares. This isn't madness in the clinical sense. This is something I did to myself, one patient at a time, filling myself with horrors until the container finally cracked. The apartment's air grows thick, harder to breathe, as if the nightmares are displacing oxygen with their presence. I hear scratching from within the walls, not like mice or insects, but deliberate, purposeful. The sound of something trying to write a message in wood and drywall. My phone lies on the kitchen counter, screen dark. I could call someone, a colleague, emergency services, anyone. But what would I say? That the nightmares I've been collecting like other people collect stamps have finally achieved critical mass? That the fears I've been swallowing for 2 decades are staging a prison break through my perception of reality? Instead, I find myself walking to my study, guided by an instinct I don't fully understand. The room is exactly as I left it. Desk neat, files organized, the leather chair positioned precisely in front of my patient notes. But it feels different now, like a stage set rather than a workspace. The books on the shelves seem to lean inward, their spines pressing closer together, titles blurring into illegibility. In the corner stands something I haven't seen in waking life before, The amalgamation of every claustrophobic fear I've ever absorbed. A space that's somehow smaller on the outside than the inside. Geometry folded wrong. Looking at it makes my eyes hurt, my brain struggling to process dimensions that shouldn't exist. The desk drawer opens at my touch, revealing my patient journal. 17 volumes over 23 years, each entry detailing the nightmares I've consumed, the fears I've made my own. My handwriting deteriorates through the volumes, starting neat and professional, ending in barely legible scrawls. The most recent entries are in a script I don't recognize, though I remember writing them. A sound behind me, not footsteps, but the suggestion of movement, the way air shifts around a presence. I don't turn around. I know what's there, all of them, every manifested terror, gathered like congregants in a church of horrors. They're not threatening me. They're waiting for me to understand. The medication didn't just suppress the nightmares. It kept them from integrating, from becoming part of the ecosystem of my mind. Now, unshackled and unmediated, they're doing what nightmares do. They're teaching me fear. My fear. Not borrowed or absorbed, but genuinely mine. The fear that I've been doing this for nothing, that each nightmare I consumed didn't actually help my patients, but simply transferred their suffering to me. The fear that I've been feeding something inside myself all these years, fattening it up on other people's terrors until it grew strong enough to manifest. The fear that there is no treatment, no cure, no ritual that will put them back in their cage. The fear that I've never been the therapist at all, but the patient. The room temperature drops, my breath forming clouds in the air. The nightmares press closer, their presence a weight on my skin. I understand what they want, what they've always wanted. They want acknowledgement. They want integration. They want to stop being separate things I've shoved down into darkness and become part of the whole. The only way forward is back. Back to sleep. Back to the source. Back to the place where I first learned to touch other people's dreams. If the nightmares have escaped into my waking world, then maybe I need to meet them in their territory, where they're strongest, where I'm weakest. The bedroom feels miles away, though it's just down the hall. Each step takes effort, like wading through syrup, through accumulated dread given physical form. The manifested fears follow, a procession of horrors at my back. The surgeon's failure walks beside the teacher's oblivion. The banker's poverty shadows the artist's death. They've waited so long for this, patient as monuments. My bed looks like an altar, sheets white as bones in the darkness. The pills remain on the nightstand, but I make no move toward them. They're the barrier, and the barrier is the problem. I lie down on sheets that feel both too soft and too rough, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. The ceiling above me pulses with shadow shapes, fears taking form and dissolving and reforming. Closing my eyes doesn't help. The nightmares exist beyond the binary of eyes open or closed now. Sleep should be impossible, but it comes fast, rushing up like dark water, drowning me before I can fight it. Or maybe I'm not falling asleep at all. Maybe I'm finally waking up. The last thing I register in the physical world is the feeling of countless hands on my skin, not violent, but insistent, pulling me down into the place where all nightmares begin, into the place I've been building inside myself for 23 years, one absorbed fear at a time. I wake up in my office, but I don't have an office anymore. Haven't for 6 months. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, that particular frequency that used to give me headaches during long sessions. My patient, a young person whose name I can't quite recall, sits across from me, describing their nightmare in a voice that seems to come from very far away. I'm nodding, taking notes, the pen moving across paper with a scratching sound that might be coming from inside the walls. The patient's face keeps shifting. First one person, then another, cycling through 743 different faces, all the people I've treated, all the nightmares I've consumed. They're all speaking at once now, a chorus of fears and anxieties, their voices layering over each other until the words become just sound, just static, just the white noise of accumulated terror. I try to speak, to ask them to slow down, to wait their turn, but my mouth won't work. When I look down at my notes, they're not words anymore, but drawings. Crude, childish sketches of the things that have manifested in my apartment. Or have they always been there? Have I been drawing them my entire career? The patient stands, but they're not leaving. They're multiplying. The office fills with them. All my patients, all their nightmares still wearing human shapes. They're reaching for me, not to harm but to return what's theirs, to put back the fears I took from them. But if I give them back, what will be left of me? The office walls dissolve like smoke, and I'm falling through layers of consciousness I don't have names for. Past and present blur together. I see myself as a resident, making the first breakthrough with that elderly woman. But now I notice details I'd forgotten. The way her eyes had gone black when I pulled the nightmare from her mind. The way my reflection in the window had smiled when I wasn't smiling. Had I discovered the technique, or had it discovered me? The falling stops. I'm in a room I don't recognize, though something about it feels deeply familiar. It's empty except for a mirror that takes up an entire wall. In the reflection, I see myself, but younger, from before my residency, before medical school. The me in the mirror is smiling, and there's something hungry in that expression. I speak, though I don't hear words so much as feel them. Finally ready to remember. The room fills with light, harsh and clinical, and suddenly I'm strapped to a bed in a white room. Hospital restraints on my wrists and ankles. A doctor I don't recognize leans over me, checking my pupils, making notes. In the corner, someone is crying. Is that me? A different version of me. The scene shifts again. Now I'm the one making rounds, but the hospital is all wrong. The patients in the beds aren't patients. They're the nightmares, tucked in and sedated, and I'm the one checking their vitals, adjusting their medication, making sure they stay quiet. Patient exhibits persistent delusion of being a therapist who treats nightmares. A voice reads from somewhere I can't see. 23 years in treatment, shows no signs of improvement, continues to consume excessive sedatives while maintaining elaborate fantasy of absorbing others' fears, recommends continuation of current regimen. The white room, my apartment, my office, they're all the same place now. Layers of the same location folded over each other like pages in a book. I can see through all of them at once. The manifestations that filled my apartment are also orderlies in white coats. The patients in my practice are also visitors from the outside world who come to stare at me through observation glass. Which layer is real? Which is the nightmare? I try to scream, to wake up, to find solid ground. But there is no ground anymore. There's only the falling, the endless tumbling through realities that might all be equally true or equally false. In the distance, someone is shaking my shoulder, calling my name. Or maybe they're calling someone else's name and I've just been borrowing it all these years, another thing I absorbed and claimed as my own. The voice says something about 24 hours without response, about adjusting the medication, about how the patient seems to be experiencing another episode. But I'm also still in my bed, in my apartment, surrounded by manifested nightmares that are either my creations or my captors. I'm also still in my office, treating patients who may or may not exist. I'm also in a white room, being treated myself. I'm all of these places at once, and none of them, and the only thing I know with certainty is that I'm afraid. Genuinely, originally afraid, not with someone else's fear, but with my own. And maybe that was always the point. Maybe this is what I've been trying to teach myself all along. Or maybe I'm about to wake up and find out which version of reality gets to keep me, if I wake up at all.